Nightmares. Some say that dreams are only images created by the mind. Others aren't so sure. Grandma. Joel was 4 years old. He was on vacation, visiting his grandparents who lived in the desert. After playing in the hot gravel driveway for a time, the boy went inside where it was cool. In the living room of the little mobile home, the whole family was together. Grandma and Grandpa, Mother and Father, and Joel's infant brother, Seth. It was Joel's favorite place to be. Everything was perfect. At noontime, Father went outside to pack the van. Grandpa followed to help out. "We are going on a hike," said Joel's mother. "You kids are staying here with Grandma and Grandpa, okay?" "Okay, Mommy," replied the boy. She placed Joel on his grandmother's lap. Then she put little Seth on the carpet by his grandmother's feet. With her white hair and wrinkled face, Grandma looked down at Joel and smiled. But when Mother turned away to look out the window at Joel's father, Joel saw Grandma's face suddenly twist and change. There before him, she became a horrifying and demonic pig with razor-sharp teeth and tiny glowing red eyes which were staring back at point-blank range. The motionless, glaring face was only inches away, and it filled the boy's entire view. Sitting on Grandma's lap, pressed against her body, Joel was so afraid that he could not even breathe. All he could do was look to his mother. But when Mother turned back from the window, Grandma's face became normal again in an instant. Mother never saw what happened, and neither did Seth, who was on the floor playing with blocks. Mother quickly waved goodbye and left through the sliding glass door. Terrified, Joel could not even whimper, let alone call to his mother for help. Joel and his baby brother Seth were all alone now with Grandma, whose grip had begun to tighten. With her white hair and normal wrinkled face, she looked down at Joel and smiled. Clipping. 10-year-old Stephen Pugh had stayed up all night, unable to sleep. He was too excited for his family's trip to the amusement park. By morning, however, he was bursting with energy and felt a great sense of wonder and anticipation for the day to come. When the car pulled into the enormous lot, the entire family climbed out and stretched their limbs. Mother, Father, and Stephen's younger brother, Tony. The children had never been to the amusement park before, but Tony had been excelling in school and baseball in recent months, so it was no surprise that Mother and Father had allowed him to go. Stephen's grades and physical abilities were quite poor, but they had let him come along anyway. He was surprised by this, since they seemed so disappointed in him lately.
"Look at all the neat rides!"
Stephen proclaimed as they approached the entrance. Mother and Father signed a paper, paid the money, and then each member of the family had their hands stamped. Inside they went, one by one. In the distance was a strange and wonderful roller coaster. It had a large glowing sign on the top that read, "Clipping."
"Mother! Father! Can we go on that one?"
Stephen cried out with great enthusiasm. Father agreed.
"If that's the one you want, son, then of course you can ride it."
Stephen's younger brother seemed unhappy with this choice. In fact, he seemed unhappy with everything lately. Moving up the beautiful midway toward the snaking roller coaster, the family passed another ride called Bobbins. This ride consisted of 2 gigantic arms with caged gondolas on each end. They were like the heads of towering, rotating hammers. Stephen and the family watched as an elderly man and a large gray dog were put into the 2 opposite gondolas. As they moved past the attraction toward Clipping, the gondolas were quickly secured shut and the giant machine arms raised upwards to begin the ride. They slowly began to swing in unison. Higher and higher they went. Stephen Pugh could barely take his eyes off the fantastic sight, but Mother and Father were insistent that they hurry to the roller coaster. Suddenly, there was an enormous cracking sound, and when Stephen looked back, he saw that the arms were now completely stopped and pressed together in their starting position. It had sounded almost as if the two cars had collided in midair. Stephen saw the old man and the dog being lifted out of the carriages, but they were not moving at all. They were asleep now. The sight made Stephen feel very strange. As the family continued on, clipping loomed in front of them. Stephen was so excited to ride on his first roller coaster that for a moment he almost completely forgot about the old man and the dog. But entering the gate to the non-existent line, Stephen suddenly got a bad feeling. He turned to his family, who had stopped in their tracks behind him.
Mother? Father?
He asked.
Why do dogs and old people go on the rides here?
Mother and Father hesitated. They both gazed down upon him. Tony just looked away. Son, Father said, kneeling down to the boy, everyone has their usefulness. Everyone and everything. But when you stop contributing to the family unit, to society, well, then it's time to come to the amusement park. It's just easier that way. It's a good thing.
I don't understand. Aren't you coming?
The boy asked, looking at his family who had stopped there just before the ride. No, we'll just watch, Father said, half smiling. This ride is only for you. Honestly, the amusement park was always just for you. This is your place, buddy. Mother chimed in.
Don't worry, Stephen. They make it fun, and the ride is over very fast. You don't have to be afraid. You won't feel a thing.
The boy didn't understand what they were saying. Mother and Father gently pushed Stephen through the gates toward the roller coaster train, which was just pulling up. Inside, ready to get off, was another boy. He was slumped over, and his eyes were closed. His face was severely deformed. He seemed to have been disabled from birth. He was asleep now. The boy's parents stood waiting at the ride's exit. Between them was a small, empty wheelchair. The Timeout Corner. On a cold January night, two brothers played with their toy trucks on the brown shag carpet in their living room. An old lamp cast a warm yellowish glow on Paul, age 3, and Lee, age 7. Downstairs in the basement, their parents were having a party with friends and showing slides from their most recent trip to the lake. As time went on, the boys began to feel more and more isolated from the others. The upstairs rooms and hallways were completely dark. Everything was dark, except for the pool of light in the living room. Paul, in his little one-piece pajama suit, suddenly stopped pushing the red fire engine and began rubbing his eyes and whining.
What's wrong?
Lee asked his brother. Paul replied, I'm scared. Lee wanted to tell his brother not to be afraid. He wanted to show that he wasn't a baby like Paul. But Lee was also afraid. I want Mommy, said Paul.
You can't go downstairs, explained Lee. We have to play up here until the slides are over.
Paul shook his head, frowning.
I don't care. I'm scared. I want Mommy and Daddy.
Lee tried to laugh.
What are you afraid of?
Paul, still rubbing his eyes, reached out his little hand, pointing to the small nook in the living room that disappeared around the corner and into the darkness. Hidden in the nook was an old back door that hardly anyone ever used. It was where the children were sent to sit when they were naughty or disobedient. Lee's anxiety level climbed higher than before. He tried to hide it, but he felt it too. A strange presence. It was as though something was there with them, as though something was watching them. Something hiding around the corner in the darkened timeout room. Something that had just come in through the old back door. No, thought Lee. Paul is just scared. I'm scared too, but there's nothing there. It's all my imagination. I'm big now. I can't be like Paul. Just when Lee was about to tell his baby brother not to be afraid, that it was only his imagination, the lamp flashed and the bulb went out. Now the only light was the faint, fuzzy glow coming from the basement, through the kitchen and down the hall. Paul grabbed on to his older brother and began crying softly. "Shh," whispered Lee. "It's just the light. It burned out." Lee's anxiety intensified. Something was happening. He felt an immediate need to take his brother downstairs to the grown-ups, but he was unable to move. The two could only sit there, motionless in the dark. It was then that they heard it. A bizarre sound. A sound coming from the timeout area. There was something there, hidden around the corner in the nook. Lee and Paul froze, paralyzed with fear. They both knew that the only thing they could do was to go to the basement. The adults could protect them from anything. The bad feeling would go away, and they would be safe if they could only find the strength to go to the basement. But they could not move. Facing the timeout corner, the children's eyes slowly began to adjust to the darkness. For a time, there was nothing there, and all was quiet. But then, they saw it. A sight that instantly sucked the air out of their lungs and made their bodies freeze like ice. There appeared a head peering out from around the corner. But it was black and rectangular. A rectangle head with triangle eyes. A head with a long neck and metal eyebrows that were upturned in extreme anger. The whole thing began to vibrate in a blur, then retracted back behind the corner. For a moment, there was only the sound of Lee making a tiny, involuntary whine. This was followed by several moments of deafening silence. Then it happened. The entire horrifying thing exploded out from behind the wall and darted violently toward them. It lunged forward, reaching out with a long, black, claw-like appendage. Without even realizing it, Lee had already grabbed his brother by the hand and was running faster than he ever had before, out of the living room and into the kitchen. But it was coming, following directly behind, and moving at an incredible speed. A living machine, black and skeletal, with boxy, bulging sections. The boys shot down the hall, the hideous thing directly behind them. Lee pivoted left toward the steep steps to the basement. Paul was screaming and screaming. At the top of the stairs, Lee could feel the thing reach out for them. In one desperate, frantic movement, Lee took his little brother by the waist and leapt all the way to the bottom, landing hard. "Daddy!" screamed the boy as he and his brother wriggled frantically into the light of the slide projector. "Help us!" When the adults saw that the children had jumped all the way down the steps, saw the way they were screaming and crying hysterically, trying so desperately to get away from something upstairs, the men leapt to their feet and rushed up the stairs to find a possible intruder. They turned on all the lights, went through every room, looked in every closet and hiding place. They never found anything. Cotton candy. Sam and Susan rode their tricycles along the winding mountain road. To one side, a cliff stretched upward forever into a gray, nondescript sky, and to the other, a sheer drop-off that seemed to disappear into the monochrome fog below. Sam was afraid, but nevertheless, the two continued on, pedaling up the rocky, narrow path. Susan was Sam's sister, but also his mother. There was no one else in the world. She was the only other person who existed, besides the man who sold the cotton candy just ahead. When they reached the stand, which was perched precariously on the edge of the deadly cliffside trail, Sam saw that the man was no longer working there. Now the strange cotton candy machine was completely automated, distributing long strands of the stuff all by itself, with no one there to monitor its activity. Sam wanted nothing more in the world than to have some of the cotton candy with Susan, and he knew that she would want nothing more than to have some with him. He pulled up to the machine under the giant torn umbrella and pushed the button to start the device. But as he waited for the machine to distribute the long snake of tightly wound fluff, Susan started to ride away. She pedaled up the cliff and would not slow down. Sam did not know why.
"Wait!" he yelled. "I gotta get some cotton candy!"
Susan would not slow down.
"I gotta get some cotton candy!"
he cried out once again. Susan would not even turn around. It was as if she did not even hear Sam. It was as if she did not even know he was there. She pedaled away as the old machine slowly began to activate. Somehow, Sam could not leave the machine without the cotton candy. But it was taking forever. Nothing was happening. He was so frustrated and afraid that he began to shake. He felt sick to his stomach.
"I gotta get some cotton candy!"
Sam was now hysterical, but Susan would not turn around. All Sam could see was the back of her moving away, up and over the hill. Somehow he knew that if he did not stay with Susan, he would not see her again. She was his sister, but also his mother. There was no one else in the world. She was the only other person who existed.
"Don't leave me!"
he cried out with tears in his eyes. Sam watched as Susan and her tricycle disappeared over the hill and into the fog. When I Wake Up. 8-year-old Bradley awoke in the night from a terrible dream. Frightened, he got up and climbed the little ladder to the top bunk where his brother slept, then reached around in the dark to feel for his foot. But there was no one there. Maybe he went to get a drink of water or go to the bathroom, the boy thought. Bradley decided to go to the next room to sleep in the bed with his mother and father. He went down the hall and opened his parents' door a crack, then snuck inside and carefully tried to lay down without waking them. But there was no one there to snuggle up to. The bed and the room were empty. He went to the light and flipped the switch, but nothing happened. He crept to the kitchen and tried the lights. There seemed to be no power to the house at all. Bradley peered through the curtained window to see if anyone was outside, but he could see nothing. There were no streetlights on, and the neighborhood was covered in a thick, ominous fog. After standing motionless for what seemed like an eternity, Bradley called out to his parents.
"Mom? Dad?"
But there was no reply. No sound of footsteps or voices anywhere. It was dead silent. The boy made his way through the house, anxiously checking each room. It was completely deserted. Back in the kitchen, as the reality of being left alone in the darkness with no explanation sunk in, Bradley's mind began playing tricks on him. It was then that he thought he saw something moving in the shadows near the refrigerator. Waves of terror coursed through him. He didn't know what to do. He froze and remained motionless in the dark. After a long period of standing perfectly still, Bradley summoned the courage to rush to the front door and feel around the little hooks for the spare key to the family van. As he searched, there came a sound from behind, like a chair being moved over the linoleum floor. At that moment, he found the key and immediately darted out the front door to the detached garage. Once inside, he could just barely make out the vehicle that was parked there as usual. He looked out and discovered that his father's brown sedan was also still parked in the driveway. They didn't leave? He thought in a panic. I don't understand. Where are they? Where did they go? And what was that sound in the kitchen? Bradley didn't feel safe. He knew that he couldn't go back into the house alone. He was sure he'd seen something in the darkness. So he climbed inside the back seat of the van and locked all the doors. His mind was racing, imagining the worst. His family was dead, had abandoned him, or simply disappeared. In the van, he began to feel more and more like he was being watched. He climbed under the bench seat and hid. Eventually, he fell asleep. When Bradley awoke, he found he was in his bedroom on the bottom bunk. It was all just a terrible dream, he thought. He was so disturbed by the experience that he got up, climbed the little ladder to the top where his brother slept, and then reached around in the dark to feel his brother's foot. But there was no one there. He ran to his parents' room. It was also empty. The house was completely deserted. The lights weren't working. The power seemed to be out. Maybe I'm just dreaming. This must all be a bad dream. When I wake up, everything will be all right. Bradley tiptoed through the dark toward the kitchen, and this time he went straight to the phone to call 911. But when he lifted the receiver and put it to his ear, he discovered the line was completely dead. Only a strange buzzing sound could be heard on the other end. Immediately after hanging up, he thought he saw something in the darkness moving toward him. In a desperate panic, Bradley bolted out the front door and ran down the street in his pajamas toward the neighbor's house. He repeatedly turned around to see if anything was following him, but nothing was there. The streetlights were dark. There seemed to be no power in the area at all. When he reached the house, the boy began pounding on the door. No one answered, so he knocked on all the windows and called out for help, but there was no response. Bradley noticed bicycles lying in the front yard. He decided to borrow the closest bike and head for his aunt and uncle's house, which was several miles away. He had never done anything like this before, but nothing like this had ever happened. Bradley began pedaling frantically down the road. He could barely see anything in the darkness and the fog. There were no cars driving out on the main roads, no lights on, no people anywhere. Maybe it was because it was so late at night. He rode for over an hour on the dark main roads, and the entire time saw no signs of other people. Bradley had never felt so lost and alone. When he reached his aunt and uncle's house, the boy once again pounded on doors and windows, but there was no one home. He climbed the fence and crawled through the dog door on the side of the house. Once inside, he searched every room, hyperventilating and in an utter panic. The rooms were all empty, and so were the beds. The phone didn't work. The lights didn't work. He was completely alone. Bradley was now hysterical and in tears, but he went silent when he once again began to feel as though something was watching him. He then saw something moving in the shadows and began to hear strange noises all around. He wanted to leave, to find a police station, somewhere, anywhere. He desperately needed to find people, but he did not know where to go. He eventually hid in a bottom cupboard and stayed there. He curled up in a ball, trembling in the pitch black, hiding from the buzzing and humming sounds and from the moving shadows that were all around him. At some point, he fell asleep. When Bradley awoke, he found himself back in his bunk bed at home. He listened for his brother's breathing. There was no sound whatsoever. He somehow already knew that he was completely alone in the house. Yet, he felt that, from the darkness, someone or something was watching him, staring at him. There were strange sounds all around, although louder and more frightening than before. Something was moving in the darkness. With tears now streaming down his face, Bradley could do nothing but cover himself with his blanket. "This is just a bad dream. Just a nightmare," he told himself. "When I wake up, everything will be all right." Unearthly fates. Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall into it, and he that rolleth a stone, it will roll back on him. Proverbs 26:27. Mannequin. Barbara Campbell loved to shop. She spent most of her free time at the mall, visiting all the boutiques, department stores, clothing stores, and, of course, the shoe store. She had an incredibly large collection of purses, earrings, bracelets, dresses, shoes, and hats. She filled her apartment with so much stuff that it might as well have all been junk. Most of it still had tags attached. Barbara, or Babs as she was known to her co-workers, not so much to her friends as she had none, was the most self-centered and vain person for 100 miles. All she cared about was shopping, and she was rude to everyone she came across. The people who worked at the stores couldn't stand her. Whenever they saw the woman with her giant gouty hair and ridiculous hat, they would run away and hide in the back storerooms. Barbara's favorite store was a boutique on the second floor of the mall. She would ride the escalator up, after stopping by the food court for a diet soda, and head in a straight line to the entrance. The boutique had a modern window display featuring mannequins wearing all the latest fashion trends. Babs loved the mall, but she hated all the shoppers and employees. She hated the noisy kids and the people at the movie theater, and she especially hated the worthless bums begging for money and food in the parking lot. The woman had a reputation for shoving and spitting. She would verbally and even physically attack people who displeased her. And it seemed wherever she went, the people displeased her.
What do you mean you don't have it in blue?
Barbara was furious with the teenage girl who was helping her at the boutique and, as usual, demanded to speak to Cliff, the store manager. But when the man explained that the dress did not come in blue, the woman became irate. Ranting and raving, she walked up and down the aisle, cursing and spitting. This had happened many times before. Cliff wanted nothing more than to call security and have her ejected from the mall. Unfortunately, he had been told by the owner of the store to do everything possible to make the woman happy, as she would regularly spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars per month there. When Cliff offered to give her a discount on a similar dress that came in blue, Babs began grabbing items from the shelves and racks and throwing them onto the floor in a temper tantrum. But even after such behavior, no one called security or stood up to her in any way. She finally left with armfuls of merchandise she had eventually purchased on her credit card. On her way out of the building, as she crossed the street and into the parking lot, Babs stepped directly in front of a speeding car full of high school students. Arms filled with bags of shoes and clothing, she didn't look where she was going. Neither did the driver. The car went right over the woman, and she was killed instantly. A year passed, and there was very little drama at the mall, with the woman no longer there to cause it. No one missed Barbara Campbell at all. One Sunday morning, Cliff received a delivery. It was a large wooden box containing the new store mannequins. He spent the next hour putting the new models together and dressing the window. Now there were 3 new mannequins, all wearing the latest fashions. But it wasn't until the man walked outside the store to examine the full display that he noticed something strange. The first 2 mannequins looked normal. They were lifeless, inanimate objects. But the last mannequin was different. It looked more alive. It looked like her. Exactly like her. Exactly like Barbara Campbell. Dog food. In the dark recesses of the dirty, run-down industrial zone on the bad side of town was an old factory that made cheap, foul-smelling dog food. The plant manager was Frank Bloom. He was the meanest man you could ever work for, and a horrible miser. Frank would constantly bully and belittle the workers beneath him for the smallest things. Worst of all, he had been stealing money from the company for years. When one of the more brave employees, a man named Dan Gold, threatened to expose Frank, the manager became violent and beat Dan within an inch of his life in front of everyone. But Dan did not back down, and he proclaimed the incident would be Frank's downfall. No one else dared say anything about the abuse. The next day, when Dan came into work, he walked right up to Frank and let him have it.
"Frank, you're a horrible person! I won't let you get away with any of this! I'm going straight to the union about you, and then you'll be finished!"
Frank was furious. But instead of attacking Dan as he had done before, he simply stomped away, fuming with anger. That night, after work, Dan clocked out and headed to his car to return home. Suddenly, he heard the echo of footsteps coming from somewhere in the parking lot. He turned, but no one was there. He pulled out his keys and began to unlock his car door. At that moment, a blunt object came down on the back of Dan's head, knocking him out cold. When he came to, Dan was back inside the dog food factory. He had a cracked skull and a terrible pounding headache. He looked about with blurred vision and found that he was up on the catwalk near the chute leading to the gigantic meat grinder. And there, standing above him, was Frank Bloom. Dan couldn't move. He looked down and saw that his hands and feet were tied together with duct tape.
"Your service to the company is no longer needed,"
said Frank.
"You're fired!"
At that moment, Dan watched as Frank lifted the big lever, activating the meat grinder. A terrible screeching sound was heard as the machine came to life. Terrified, Dan realized what was about to happen.
"You're insane if you think you can kill me here!"
he cried out.
"You'll never get away with this! I won't let you!"
Frank just laughed.
"Oh yes, I will. No one will ever know. I'm gonna turn you into dog food and feed you to my dog at home. There won't be any evidence left."
Lying there on the catwalk, Dan could only watch helplessly as the man standing above him moved closer. Dan's eyes widened in terror. Then, in an instant, Frank Bloom lunged forward and shoved Dan down the chute and into the meat grinder. The next morning, the other employees noticed that Dan Gold, who was always on time, had not come into work. Everyone asked Frank where Dan was, but Frank didn't respond. He only turned and walked away, chuckling under his breath. As Frank had promised, he had killed Dan and turned him into dog food. Throughout the day, unknowing workers transferred the food into cans. After work, Frank took a case of the cans home. His huge black Rottweiler was there waiting for him, hungry for meat as always. Frank gleefully opened some of the cans and slopped the grayish mush into a big bowl. The drooling animal devoured it in an instant. Frank smiled with great satisfaction. He planned to feed this new batch of food to his pet until all the cans were gone. On Monday, Frank noticed that the dog was oddly quiet. Instead of barking and howling when he pulled into the driveway, it just waited silently at the window, staring at him. On Tuesday, the animal was acting even more strange. Walking in circles and grunting, it had the most peculiar look in its eyes. Crazed and cold. It began glaring at him as if it hated the man. On Friday night, when Frank came home from work to feed the giant pet more of the food, it slowly approached the man and stood on the kitchen rug behind him. Frank tore open the very last can of the food and dumped it in the bowl. But the dog did not seem interested. It just kept staring at him. It began snarling and baring its teeth, and suddenly the Rottweiler looked like a monster there before him. Frank shook his head.
"You stupid dog! What's the matter with you?"
He pointed to the bowl of slop.
"Eat the food! Eat the food!"
At that moment, the giant black Rottweiler sprang forward and attacked, lunging directly at the fat man's neck. The dog's hideous maw closed around his throat in an instant, and Frank Bloom was pulled violently down to the kitchen floor, kicking and screaming. Several days passed. The police, after hearing reports of both Dan Gold and Frank Bloom having gone missing, went to each of their houses. They never found any trace of Dan Gold, but when they arrived at the house of Frank Bloom, they discovered a gruesome and horrifying scene in the kitchen. A giant, overfed Rottweiler that had nearly completely devoured its owner. Miners. Carlos was walking along the top of the flat mesa just outside his small desert town when he heard a strange sound. At first, he didn't know what it was. It seemed to be coming from somewhere up ahead. He followed the sound to an area near a cluster of large barrel cactuses. There he saw a small rusty pipe coming out of the parched desert ground. From the pipe came a sound. It was the sound of screaming. The screams of men from somewhere down below, crying out for help. This ventilation pipe must lead to the old mine, he thought. There are miners trapped down there! The sounds of the tormented people from below unnerved the man. He began to shout down into the pipe. Hello? Hello? But the screaming simply faded away, and soon only the eerie sound of the desert wind remained. They must be in real trouble, thought Carlos. He ran as fast as he could back to town, all the way to the sheriff's station. When he reached the station, he went straight to the sheriff and began to tell him about the incident. There are miners trapped down there! You have to send help! The sheriff and his deputy looked at each other, then at Carlos.
There were miners trapped down there, but not anymore,
said the sheriff. What do you mean? I heard them! They were screaming! The sheriff shook his head.
Son, there isn't anyone down there. That mine's been sealed off since 1935, when a cave-in trapped 12 men inside. When rescuers finally reached them, it was too late. They were all dead. No one made it out alive.
Ms. Ray. Trisdina Ray lived alone in a giant Victorian mansion in the old part of town. She had no husband or family, only several cats. For a time, she was very ill, but her health had begun to improve. One day, she met a salesman named Nolan, who showed up at her doorstep. She invited him inside, and the two drank tea and chatted for hours. Nolan was a wonderful man, and he and Trisdina quickly fell in love. Soon they were married in a private ceremony in the backyard. The couple spent the entire winter intimately talking and making plans for their future. For the first time in Trisdina's life, it seemed as though she was not alone. Then one night, Trisdina and Nolan were visited by a young girl who was peering through their icy window. She claimed that she did not know who she was or where she came from. The couple decided to adopt the girl, and they named her Destiny. In time, they grew to consider her their very own daughter. As winter turned to spring, more and more people began to inexplicably show up at the house. They were often lost, lonely, or homeless, and all without names. Miss Ray was generous and gave each of them a name and a permanent home in the sprawling mansion. After many years, the house was filled with people constantly roaming about, needing food and attention. Miss Ray, who had received a sizable inheritance from her late father's oil stock, would always provide. But although she was no longer alone, she could not help but feel strangely depressed. Trisdina's health had once again been declining. After a long period of feeling unwell, she finally went to see a doctor. He told her that she had an infection, a parasite called toxoplasmosis that she must have contracted from her many cats. He told her all about the illness, and then he gave her a prescription and sent her on her way. When she arrived home, she was welcomed by all the people that made up her new family. But it didn't make her happy. Tristina was despondent. "I love you so much, Nolan," she told her husband. "But no matter how many people we bring into our home, I just feel as though something is wrong. I feel empty and alone here. Completely alone." Nolan shook his head in sympathy. "It must be the infection. Remember what the doctor said. He told you that the parasite can cause mental illness. Now that you're taking the medication, you should start to feel better." One evening, Miss Tristina Ray, who had just finished making supper, called for Nolan and Destiny to come and eat. They seemed to be outside somewhere. Soon the two came walking through the door. But when she looked up at them, the woman suddenly realized why she had felt so alone. She could now see them for what they really were. Nolan and Destiny and the dozens of other people who lived in her house were nothing more than stray cats. Kevin. It was late one cold winter night when a man came through the door of the local bar. Wind and snow from the blizzard rushed inside with him. The bartender recognized him as the priest from the next town over. He walked up to the bar, sat down on a stool, and ordered a strong drink. He looked visibly shaken, as if he had just seen the devil himself.
"I haven't seen you in here before, Father,"
said the bartender, who was the only other person in the bar at such a late hour.
"What brings you here this evening?"
The priest brushed the freshly fallen snow from his black garments.
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
The bartender was intrigued.
"Well, people confess things to you. Maybe you'd like to confess something to me."
The priest took a sip of his drink and smiled nervously, his hands shaking.
That's what this is all about. But I'm not supposed to give details of confessions. We take an oath. Of course, I guess I'm not supposed to drink either.
The bartender was now more curious than ever.
"Well, let me buy you one, and maybe you can tell me what's on your mind."
For the longest time, the priest didn't say a word. But after a few drinks, his tongue began to loosen. He slammed down his glass and began to speak.
All right, I'll tell you. But what I say doesn't leave this room.
The bartender only nodded. That's when the priest began to tell his story. A couple once lived together in a cabin high in the mountains above the town. They had been married for 10 years and absolutely hated one another. Everyone knew that the man was the meanest around. He was cruel and abusive, and he had a giant black birthmark on the side of his neck that some people believed to be a sign of evil. His wife was a small, mousy woman who lived in constant fear of the man. He would beat her and call her a fat pig and a slob, and he would throw the dinners she made right in her face. For the longest time, it went on like this. But one day, a few years ago, the man just disappeared. It was presumed that he simply moved away.
She came to church tonight,
said the priest.
Came to make her confession. That's when she told me what really happened.
When the husband threatened to kill the woman one night, she'd finally had enough. She took a loaded hunting rifle from the spot next to the fireplace and shot the man, proclaiming he was going to hell for his sins. But in his dying words, he vowed that he would take her with him. The man then died, and the woman buried his body in the forest.
She confessed her sin to me,
explained the priest,
and confessed that she felt good about killing him.
The woman later remarried and gave birth to a son named Kevin. Kevin was a deformed and sickly child. He had bulging eyes and was constantly vomiting up a foul-smelling red liquid that got everywhere and on everything. He screamed and cried non-stop in a piercing, high-pitched shriek. He scratched and clawed his mother and seemed to be in constant pain. The priest looked down at his drink.
He grows larger every day at a terrifying and unnatural rate, and now he has to be carried around in a large basket. The woman can never leave the child alone. She is forced to care for it night and day. Even her new husband left her, and now she is all alone with that thing.
The priest finished his drink and looked up.
I just saw the baby for the first time. When I did, I knew I'd be coming in here.
That's quite a story,
said the bartender. The priest smiled.
You don't understand. There's more. The baby has the exact same black birthmark on its neck as the woman's murdered husband.
The man behind the bar could only stare back in silence. The priest stood up and headed towards the door back into the blizzard. On his way out, he stopped, turned, and spoke once more.
She told him he was going to hell. He said he would take her with him. I guess, in the end, they were both right.
The Fortune Teller. Paula Peterson was walking through the rain late one evening in a strange part of town. Across the street, she saw a lit neon sign. It said Psychic Readings and featured a large glowing question mark with a moon and stars around it.
It would be nice to get out of the rain,
she thought.
Besides, I've never been to a fortune teller before. It might be fun.
Covering her head, her coat collar pulled high, the young woman dashed through the puddles to the entrance. Once inside, Paula found herself in an exotic candle-lit room. Incense perfumed the air, and sparkles danced in the light. Through an open purple curtain, she saw an odd-looking man sitting at a round table. He had a long, crooked nose, dark eyes, and a pencil-thin mustache. He wore a puffy hat and some type of magician's cloak. Before him on the table was a crystal ball.
"Please sit down,"
said the man in a low, dramatic voice. Paula did, and there was a long pause. She felt awkward in this strange place. She finally spoke, breaking the silence.
I was wondering if perhaps you could read my future?
The man began to breathe heavily. He gazed into his crystal ball, then went into some kind of trance. After meditating upon the object for a time, he jolted upright in his chair and stared intensely at the woman.
"I see terrible things in your future, my dear."
Paula almost laughed out loud.
Terrible?
She didn't believe in any of this whatsoever, but she played along. It was all in good fun. The strange man asked,
"Do you have a pet at home, my dear? Cat or dog?"
I have a dog, a little Scottish terrier.
The man looked back into the crystal ball and waved his hands around.
The dog will run away and never be yours again."
Paula was not impressed by the statement.
I doubt it. He'd never do that. What else do you see?
The fortune teller pressed his fingertips to his temples and began to hum.
"I see fire, loss of property, complete ruin and destruction."
Paula frowned. If this phony fortune teller couldn't come up with something positive, maybe an inheritance from a relative or a new romance, she figured he wasn't very good at his job. She had come in looking for shelter and entertainment, but she didn't feel entertained at all. She stood up and began to leave.
"Where are you going?"
he asked.
"Surely you want to hear the most important prophecy of all."
Paula could not help but stop and listen. The man gazed back into the crystal ball. He was humming and moaning and waving his hands around like a crazy person. Then he stopped and spoke once more.
I see the most terrible of all things, my dear. Terrible for you.
Paula was quite annoyed.
What now? I see death! I see murder! I see
The killer.
a rope around your neck! The strangler is coming! He's coming for you! Flee! Flee while you can! Stop lying!
Paula cried. The fortune teller raised his hands into the air.
No, my dear. Everything I say will come true. It always does.
With tears forming in her eyes, Paula turned and ran right out the door back into the rain. On the way home, she could almost swear someone was following her. The next morning, Paula expected to be awoken by her Scottish terrier, but when she got up, the little dog was nowhere to be found. The young woman walked all throughout the neighborhood, calling his name and asking neighbors if they had seen him, but there was no trace of the animal. Heading back, Paula noticed smoke coming from the area where she lived. She raced toward it only to discover her whole house engulfed in flames, her entire life burning before her eyes. Paula suddenly remembered what the fortune teller had told her. Everything he had said, it was all coming true. She heard fire engines coming down the street, but she couldn't stay there any longer. She knew that the last prophecy could come true at any moment. The Strangler was coming. Paula jumped in her car and sped back to the strange part of town. Maybe the fortune teller knew a way to stop all of this. She burst through the door of the little shop. The man was there behind the table. He appeared to be waiting for her.
You were right about me! You were right about everything!
Paula collapsed into the chair she had sat in the night before. It was all the same, only now she was hysterical. Now she believed.
Help me! My dog ran away! My house is on fire! It's burning to the ground! Please, you have to tell me how to stop this all from happening! You must have some kind of a talisman or a spell or something, anything that will stop the last prophecy from coming true! You have to save me from the killer. I don't want to die!
The man got up, walked around the table, and stood above the young woman. At that moment, she saw her little dog come running out from the back room. It jumped up and licked her face, then turned toward the fortune teller, growling and barking. Paula froze as she realized the man smelled strongly of gasoline.
My dear,
he said, now holding an old brown rope in his hands.
as I said before, everything I say will come true.
It always does. Memento Mori. A group of 7 adolescents, aged 12 to 18, were having a party late one night. They had gathered in a house several miles from the European city where they all went to school. As the party began to wind down, someone in the group mentioned a legendary site that was supposedly nearby. "It's true," said a boy. "Down a dirt road deep in the forest, there's an old church. Behind the church is a big stone building in the side of a hill. Inside the building are mummies. And below the building are the catacombs. The catacombs are filled with bones." The youngest boy then spoke. "I heard the ghosts of all the people are still walking around through the tunnels down there." One of the girls added, "I heard the tunnels under the mummy building go on for thousands of miles."
That's impossible,
said another.
No, it's true. If you go in, you'll get lost and won't ever come out.
The conversation went on like this for a while, until finally one of the teens raised their arms into the air, commanding everyone's attention, and spoke.
I know exactly where the church is. I say we all go there and see it for ourselves.
Everyone at the party went silent. Most of them did not want to go. They had a bad feeling that it would only bring trouble. But some of the older teens began to turn it into a kind of game, a dare. Whoever could go farthest on the spooky adventure, as they began to call it, would be the winner. More than one of them knew exactly where the place was, and soon, whether induced by curiosity or peer pressure, they all agreed to go. So they gathered up flashlights, climbed into 2 cars, and headed for the dark and foggy forest. The cars turned off at the dirt road and began winding through the eerie trees. For most of the trip, no one said anything, and before they knew it, the old church was coming into view. They parked the cars, and after some hesitation, opened the doors. As they walked around to the back of the church, they came to the hill. Above them was, indeed, a large stone structure built into the mound. The sight was even more surreal and haunting than they had imagined. Climbing up the steep and crumbling steps, the group came to a pair of giant ornate doors that were covered with carved images of skulls and a crucifix. The doors were fastened shut with a large chain and lock. Luckily, they had brought along a hammer, and they began to whack away at the lock until it broke. It fell to the ground with a loud thud. Upon the door, they discovered an inscription. Vita brevis breviter in brevi fineator. Mors venit velociter que neminem varetor. Omnia mors perimit et nulli miseretor. Ad mortem festinamus peccare desistamus. Life is short, and shortly it will end. Death comes quickly and respects no one. Death destroys everything and takes pity on no one. To death we are hastening. Let us refrain from sinning. Ni conversus fueres et sicut poer factus, et vitam mutavaris in meliores actus. Intraer non poteris regnum Dei beatus. Ad mortem festinamus peccare desistamus. If you do not turn back, become like a child and change your life for the better, you will not be able to enter blessed the kingdom of God. To death we are hastening. Let us refrain from sinning. The youngest, a girl of 12, was so frightened that she ran back to one of the cars, locking herself inside. Those who remained laughed, calling her chicken, then together began to pull open the heavy iron doors. The old hinges creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the dark. The group hesitated, then passed through the opening and into the unexplored chambers beyond. They may have laughed earlier, but none could ignore the fear that hung in the air. Once inside, the teens began shining their flashlights all around, illuminating a gruesome scene. There were dead bodies all around them. Skeletons and mummies and dried-out corpses. They were absolutely everywhere. Some stacked on shelves that lined the walls all the way to the ceiling, others propped up and staring down at them from above. There wasn't a space that wasn't occupied by human remains. The teens were completely surrounded by death. The 13-year-old covered his mouth as though he was about to vomit, then took off running back to the cars. The 5 remaining looked to one another, far more serious than before, and slowly began to huddle close together. Moving as one through the strange vaults, they passed more and more bodies, all with aberrant, horrifically distorted, and decaying faces gazing back at them. It was all so much worse than any of them had imagined.
"What is this place?"
asked a girl in a hissing, echoey whisper.
"Why are the bodies like this? Why aren't they in the cemetery buried in the ground?"
As they kept moving, an older boy replied,
There used to be a lot of cemeteries, but they ran out of space. There were wars and the borders changed. Weird things happened, so they dug up all the bodies and put them in here.
Then someone else spoke.
Rich and important people were put up here in the vaults. The rest are down in the catacombs.
My uncle says there are so many bones down there, no one could ever count them.
The boy took a nervous breath, then continued speaking.
The priest told us that this place is a reminder that we shouldn't waste our lives, because death comes to all. In the end, we're all dead.
When she heard this, the 14-year-old panicked and took off sprinting in the direction they had come. At this point, no one could really be blamed for running away. The 4 remaining teens moved onward through the chambers, each one more grisly and macabre than the last. Mummies and skeletons of infants and children in old-timey dresses looked down at them, attached to the walls with wire. There were monks in robes, rows of skeletal men in suits, all of them dried out and falling apart, skin peeling off faces like old wallpaper. Coffins, hundreds of years old, broken and stacked in piles. It was a vast and ancient house of death that seemed to go on forever. The motion of the flashlight beams caused the mummies to appear as though they were moving. It seemed that at any moment they would come alive and reach out for the teens. Whimpering, the 4 huddled closer and closer until they were actually holding on to each other. Some fought to use the others as shields, keeping as far away from the walls as possible. With every step, the dissonant horror of the place was becoming more and more intolerable. After winding through the upper burial vaults for what seemed like an eternity, the group came across the top of a long ladder that plummeted down into a deep, dark abyss. They pointed their flashlights down into the pit, but they could just barely make out the bottom. It was the entrance to the catacombs. Upon discovering the menacing shaft, the 15-year-old boy looked to the others.
Forget it, I'm not going down there.
Then he took off running, back to the entrance. Now, only 3 remained. Without a word, Mishka, the oldest of the group, and the one who most strongly advocated the spooky adventure in the first place, hopped a small mound of dirt and began climbing down the ancient ladder. She was just showing off at this point, wanting more than any of them to be the winner, to prove that she was the bravest of them all, to become a legend among her peers. The remaining girl and boy looked at each other in disbelief. They aimed their flashlights down and watched as Mishka's long black hair and blue dress appeared to be swallowed up by the pit. They followed reluctantly. The 3 descended the ladder into the blackness of the unknown, the air growing more cold and damp with each rung. When they finally reached the last step, they felt immediately attacked by a new level of enveloping terror. There, at the bottom, the trio discovered a dark and seemingly endless tunnel outstretched before them. Shining the flashlights all around, they could see that the subterranean tunnels were made entirely of human bones. There were skulls stacked 6 feet high in all directions, creating walls of bone that extended forever into the void before them. Even the bravest, Mishka, felt as if the universe was closing in around her. Deep down, she wanted nothing more than to escape back to the surface. A few feet from the base of the ladder was a small pillar with another inscription etched upon an old metal plate. Nos asos que aquí estamos, pelos vasos esperamos. We bones you see in this poor state, for you and yours do sit and wait. With flashlights blazing forward through the damp and dusty air, the group could see that there were many different passageways ahead, leading in all directions. Each one was just a black and gaping hole that might as well have led to the furthest reaches of space.
I
I don't think we should be down here,
hissed the younger girl. The boy agreed.
She's right. We should turn back. This is getting crazy.
Mishka rolled her eyes, trying to act tough.
Let's keep going, just a little farther.
The others looked to one another with uncertainty. After a pause, they continued following the girl down a main tunnel, broken bones crackling beneath their sneakers. When the group reached a fork in the catacombs, they glanced in every direction. All they could see were endless piles of bones and pitch-black passages. They headed to the right, and then to the left. More and more passageways began appearing all around them.
Mishka, this isn't funny anymore.
Yeah, I think we should turn back. This place is a giant maze. Everyone says it goes on for miles. It's too dangerous. We're going to get lost.
But Mishka ignored the others and began moving again without a word. She knew that if she could just keep going, the others would turn back and she would be the winner of the spooky adventure, proving herself the bravest of them all. But then, as the two watched Mishka's blue dress disappear around the next corner, there came a sound from deep in the catacombs. A sound like someone or something screaming out in the distance. It was a haunting, blood-curdling wail coming from some unknown region, and it echoed throughout the labyrinth of bones. Surely there could be no one else down there with them. Who else would be in such a place? Regardless, when they heard the scream, the 16-year-old and the 17-year-old were so spooked that they instantly took off running back in the direction they had come. The girl somehow remembered the way, but the boy could only follow. He had no idea where he was. They ran until they reached the ladder, climbed it faster than they thought possible, then sprinted back through the vault, the shadows of the mummies moving all around them. Stumbling outside, deliriously believing that the dead inside the tomb were following just behind, they rushed down the steps. Ahead, they could see their friends inside the two cars. Now there was a light on in the church, and coming up the dirt road was a vehicle. It was a police car. Everyone instantly panicked. The girl jumped into one of the cars, and the boy into the other. Both zoomed off down the road in the opposite direction with the police car in pursuit. Eventually, they lost the police in the woods and found their way back to the city. When they arrived, everyone realized that there was one person missing. It was Mishka. They talked about going back for her, but eventually agreed that it was out of the question. Mishka was on her own for now. She would have to hitchhike back, or walk, or maybe even spend the night in jail. Everyone was haunted by the idea of leaving the girl back in the tunnels, and that night all had nightmares about what it must have been like. It would have been a very cold and lonely trek back to the city, but no one knew what else to do. They guessed that she was most likely picked up by the police and charged with breaking and entering. But of all of them, she was the only one who refused to turn back. The others figured it was partly her own fault. The day came and went, and no one had heard anything from Mishka. Her parents began calling around, asking about the girl. Apparently, she hadn't come home at all. Then the police came around asking questions. At first, no one wanted to say where they had been. They would have found themselves in too much trouble. But after 4 days, the youngest boy finally broke down and admitted to his parents what had happened. It was at this time that everyone began to face the horrible reality that they were desperately trying to deny the entire time. That Mishka may never have come out of the tunnels at all. When the authorities learned of what had happened, they turned their focus to the catacombs. But after 2 weeks of search and rescue, they still hadn't found the girl. It turned out that the tunnels below the vaults truly were an enormous maze, so large and unmapped that no one knew exactly how to search them or how far they really went. After several months, everyone just gave up. Some people said that Mishka ran away, or that she died in the forest, or had been murdered. Others believed she had simply become lost in the tunnels and had died of starvation or thirst. 2 years later, a group of college students were on a mission. A mission to penetrate deep into the catacombs. They broke in via the vaults as they had done countless times before, and viewed themselves as expert urban explorers. Unlike the teens before them, they used compasses, huge spools of fishing line, and they took notes of every single twist and turn. This time, they were going to go farther than ever before. Several hours into the expedition, the college students came to a narrow passageway they had never seen before, so they added it to the map. Then they began exploring the new area, their headlamps illuminating the way. But when they turned a corner, they came upon a horrifying sight. There, lying face down in the dirt, was a body. The body of a girl. A girl with long black hair and wearing a dirty blue dress. She had practically melted into the ground. After some hesitation, they rolled the remains over. It was Mishka, the one who had been all over the news. As they gazed down upon the girl, they saw that she looked just like the rest of the hundreds of mummified corpses displayed in the vaults above. Playgrounds. A realm of children in peril, and the adults who cannot save them. Field trip. It was the day of the big field trip. The mood of the 6th grade class was cheerful and upbeat, although the weather was ominous. It would be an hour-long bus journey across the valley to the open-pit copper mine in the mountains. Normally, the mine could be seen for miles and miles, as it was the largest in the world, the size of what was once an entire mountain. But today, a heavy fog completely obscured the view. It was 9 in the morning when the children boarded the bus. Both the driver and the teacher called out to the rowdy students, reminding them to sit down in their seats. Then the bus began to move. It pulled away from the school and onto the main road, heading for the distant mountain range. For a while, the roads were familiar, part of the normal route home. But after passing apartment complexes, subdivisions, and shopping centers, they began to enter a vast expanse of fields that blanketed the undeveloped half of the valley. They would have to drive through this region for some time to make it to the mine at the base of the mountains. The weather outside was foggy and gray, and as civilization grew thinner and thinner, the fog only grew thicker. Soon the bus was driving through nothing but endless fields, and everything appeared colorless and strange through the murky windows. The heater turned on, and the smell of it permeated the crowded vehicle. The trip slowly began to feel surreal and otherworldly. Still, the dozens of 6th graders were rowdy, bouncing up and down on the seats and throwing balls of paper down the aisle at one another. Out in the fields and the mist, there was no one else for miles. No one but the children in the old yellow bus moving down the empty rural road. Then, all of a sudden, a boy yelled out,
Hey, look at that!
Outside, across the field, were several large animals. They were buffalo, inexplicably grazing on the grass. The children were amazed.
Since when are there buffalo around here?
Someone in the front called out to the teacher.
There's not supposed to be,
someone else replied. The bus quickly passed the large animals, leaving them behind. Minutes later, another commotion came from the students. There in the distance, through the clouded glass, were what appeared to be several old wagons, all in a row. They were being slowly pulled by oxen across the dreary plains.
Must be some kind of reenactment,
said the teacher to the driver. The passengers watched as the wagons faded away into the fog. About 5 minutes passed and nothing had changed. Still just misty fields as far as the eye could see. But then came another sight out the windows of the bus. A fire was burning up ahead. It was a strange fire, as it didn't seem to have much color to it. Perhaps it was because of the fog. When the bus came closer, it slowed down. Off to the side, everyone on board could see an outcropping of what appeared to be teepees. Several of the cone-shaped structures were on fire. But even more incredibly, there seemed to be dozens of bodies lying all around them. They were covered in blood and dressed in animal skin clothing. They appeared to be Native American. All of the noisy children who were climbing over each other to get a view out the windows went silent. As the bus rolled slowly past the strange scene, the passengers looked on. Then they turned to each other in shock and horror. Some even began to cry. The teacher quickly came on to the intercom.
Everyone listen up,
She announced.
It looks like there's some kind of historical reenactment going on outside. It's just like in our history class.
Many of the children then remembered their school lessons on pioneers, early settlements, and the conflicts with the native tribes. As the bus moved away from the site, the teacher continued speaking. Her voice was stressed, as though she was pretending to sound normal.
That reenactment outside was most likely showing a battle or massacre that took place in the 1800s. It may have been the famous Meadow Creek Massacre that we learned about last month in our class, where a local militia killed many Indians after years of growing conflicts.
The teacher paused for a moment, then went on.
This whole area was once sacred land to the native people who lived here long ago.
The students began to whisper to one another, many looking vigilantly out into the fog for the next possible reenactment. The teacher turned off the intercom and started speaking to the driver.
What on earth is going on out there? That's the strangest thing I've ever seen.
10 minutes passed before the driver spotted a group of figures up ahead on the side of the road. As they came closer, he slowed down again. The children then watched as the faces of an endless string of people began to go by. They were just off the road, and they were walking in one direction.
Look at all the Indians,
said a girl. The people outside had dirty faces. They were covered with mud and blood, and many of them walked barefoot. Alongside the native people were white men on horseback who looked like soldiers. They had old rifles and swords on their backs, and they kept a watchful eye on those below. The natives appeared half-starved and sickly. No one was smiling. As the bus drove further on, the passengers could see a figure just lying on the ground. A child was pulling at the clothing of the fallen woman and crying hysterically. None of the people ever looked toward the bus or anyone inside it. They seemed to pay no attention to it at all. The teacher grabbed the sleeve of the driver and hissed at him to speed up, but the trail of moving people kept going. There was no getting away from it, even as the bus began to accelerate. Next, there came the crackle of what sounded like gunfire. The driver sped up some more. To the right of the bus, among the many slowly moving people, was some kind of commotion. A fight was breaking out between the people dressed as Indians and the men dressed as soldiers. A native man was thrown to the ground by a soldier with a large greasy mustache. As he was about to strike the fallen man with his sword, another female, dressed in animal fur, threw her arm around the soldier's throat and tackled him to the ground. She was screaming in another language. In no time, there was fighting going on all around the bus. A gunshot came from a soldier sitting atop his horse, and a native man on the trail grabbed at his side, then collapsed into the mud, wincing and screaming out in pain. Soon there were gunshots and smoke coming from all directions. Everywhere outside, on both sides of the bus, people were screaming and crying out, with tears running down their dirty faces. The people seemed to be dying before the children's eyes, dying in some kind of war that was happening all around them. Up ahead, just as the scene outside descended into total chaos, the fog inexplicably began to clear, and the driver could now see the foothills of the mountain and its gigantic, ominous open-pit copper mine. Then, as the passengers watched in disbelief, All the people and all the sounds outside faded away in an instant and were gone. Hide and seek. It was too hot to play outside. Brian and his friends from the neighborhood all sat around together in the living room, restless and bored.
Let's go to the water slides,
proclaimed a chubby redhead.
Yeah, right. With what money?
Another mocked. It seemed there was nothing to do. But then one of them had an idea.
Let's play hide and seek.
For a brief moment, there was an awkwardness among the group. They were all 12 years old now. Perhaps they were too old for such a game. Fortunately, the feeling quickly faded.
Okay, we'll play,
said Brian.
But only inside, and not in my mom and dad's room or the garage. Who's gonna be first to seek?
Asked one boy.
1, 2, 3, not it!
Someone said, raising their hand. Others quickly did the same. Brian was last. The truth was, he didn't even fight it. It made him feel important to be the seeker. The boys all ran off in different directions as Brian buried his head into a blanket on the couch. He began counting loudly to 30. Footsteps thundered all over the place. When Brian got to 20, he started counting even louder. The footsteps seemed to fade away and then eventually stopped altogether.
26, 27, 28, 29, 30!
The boy stood up and faced the direction that everyone must have gone running.
Ready or not, here I come!
The first thing Brian did was imagine all the places he would hide. The basement, he thought. That's where I'd go for sure. Brian tiptoed down the hall, through the kitchen, and to the staircase. Slowly descending, he listened for anyone still trying to find a hiding spot. If they don't have one by now, too bad. He stopped midway on the steps and lowered his head. He couldn't hear anyone shuffling around down there. There wasn't a sound, only silence. Continuing on, Brian came to the entrance of the long blue family room. It was clean and empty. No way in or out without him knowing about it. In the center of the large space was a big poof pillow. Almost immediately, he saw a figure pop up from behind it. It was a boy with straight blonde hair and a bowl cut. He looked right at Brian, grinned playfully, then ducked down and disappeared behind the round shape. Brian didn't get a good enough look to know for sure who it was, but it had to be his friend Willie. He was the only one with a haircut like that.
Oh, great hiding place, Willie.
Brian chuckled sarcastically as he moved closer to the cushion. He paused momentarily, thinking to himself how unlike Willie it was to choose such a poor spot to hide. So out in the open. A prickle went up the back of his neck as he thought about how Willie had not looked quite like himself. Maybe it wasn't him at all, but another neighborhood friend. It all happened so fast. He didn't have much time to process it. When Brian reached the pillow, he hurried and kicked it over to reveal the hiding boy. But there was nothing there. In fact, there was no one in the basement at all. The others were hiding upstairs, still waiting to be found. Scrapbook. It was the 6th grade school dance. Every boy had a dance partner except for Michael, and there was only one girl standing alone in the gymnasium. Her name was Amber Jean. Everyone thought she was the creepiest person in the whole world. She was buck-toothed with braces, and she wore huge, thick librarian glasses. She had bad breath, frizzy hair, and her face was always dirty. Her nasal voice gurgled and wheezed, and she drooled a bit when she spoke. Eventually, the girl approached Michael. She was wearing her usual, an outdated pink dress.
I know you.
She smiled, revealing greenish teeth.
You're Michael.
Yeah.
He replied awkwardly. Amber Jean wasted no time. She grabbed the boy around the waist, clawing him with her long, scratchy fingernails. She started slow dancing with him, though the music hadn't even begun. Michael wanted nothing more than to run away. Soon, everyone was looking at him, pointing and laughing.
I think we were made for each other,
The girl exclaimed in her nasally gurgling voice, her arms wrapped tightly around Michael's body.
Yeah,
He cringed.
sure.
After a few moments of dancing, the girl spoke again.
You should come over to my house. I want to show you my scrapbook.
The song ended, and Michael took the opportunity to pull away.
Maybe some other time. I have to go now.
He called as he ran off toward home. That afternoon, the phone rang. His mother answered.
Just a minute.
She said, handing the phone to Michael. It was Amber Jean,
Hello, Michael.
said the creepy voice on the other end of the line.
Will you come over to my house? I want to show you my scrapbook.
No! Leave me alone!
Michael slammed down the phone. Michael's mother heard this and became very upset. When she found out what was going on, she insisted on driving him straight to the girl's house to apologize. Amber Jean lived in a rickety old place, and the front yard was cluttered with broken-down cars and worthless junk. Michael's mother watched her son nervously make his way to the entrance, his head hung low. He finally built up enough courage to knock. Amber Jean came to the door. He stammered.
I'm sorry I hung up on you.
The girl was so delighted that she grabbed him by the shirt. She pulled him inside, down some stairs, and into her very own bedroom.
Come on. I really want to show you my scrapbook.
The room was disgusting. It smelled horrible and was strewn with old clothes and garbage. Michael felt so uncomfortable that he began to sweat.
But first,
She announced.
I think we should dance.
The girl began clawing at Michael yet again. She pressed her mouth to his ear and whispered as before.
I think we were made for each other.
Her breath was so bad that it made Michael gag. She forced him to dance for several moments, even though there was no music. Then she turned away and locked the door with a key. The boy felt more helpless than ever. She was wheezing heavily as she moved about, her giant glasses fogging up, her disgusting braces forcing her chapped lips apart. Amber Jean went to her closet and started rummaging around. Moments later, she turned back, having produced a dirty old scrapbook. She began to inch closer to Michael. He felt powerless, like a fly caught in a spider's web. With an insane grin, the girl opened the book and began to turn through the pages. They all seemed to be stuck together. Inside were dried pieces of skin, bloody scalps with hair attached, small bones, and rotting, flattened pieces of meat. Higher and higher. All the local boys from school would gather at Craig Oak's house in the summertime. His parents were never home, but trusted Craig, his older brother, and their friends to be good when they were alone at the house, even though they were only 9 to 13 years of age. On a typical summer afternoon, friends would walk by the little strawberry patch on their way to the porch, ring the doorbell, and come on into the living room. One day, the boys sat around the Oaks television. On the screen was a game featuring a little man who ran around fighting all sorts of mythical monsters. As the boys played, a huge thunderstorm rolled into the neighborhood. Before long, rain was hammering the rooftop, and lightning and thunder flashed and roared throughout the little house. When they reached the part of the game where they fought wyverns and goldmen, the boys died, and it was game over, so they decided to do something else. They began to read from a book of stories about ghosts, monsters, haunted pirate ships, and various strange things. The storm outside created the perfect atmosphere for the stories, which they all took turns reading out loud. The boys listened, all huddled together on the shag carpet. Lightning flashed upon aged paintings of shipwrecks and lighthouses which hung from the wood-paneled walls of the old living room. After reading, the boys pretended that the house itself was a pirate ship in the middle of the sea during a great storm. They were inside its hull, seeking protection from the ravaging gale. Craig's older brother went on and on describing it all in perfect detail. He had a talent for storytelling. Some of them swore they could actually feel the ground sway beneath their feet. When a younger boy named Paul Black looked out the window, he saw that the Oaks' front yard, including the little strawberry patch next to the porch, was now flooded from the downpour. It was almost as though they really were out on the ocean. The boys' vivid imaginations were beginning to run wild. Suddenly, there was a huge flash, and an overwhelming rumble rocked the house. All the lights went out. The boys screamed and hollered over the noise, wrestling and rolling about in excitement. Craig found some candles and lit them with a match. The living room glowed with flickering flames that cast haunting shadows upon the walls. Sitting in a circle, the boys read more stories by candlelight, and as they did, they grew more and more afraid. Then Craig's older brother began to tell a story that was not in the book. He spoke of a house that simply disappeared. His voice was strange, eerie and hypnotic. He paused, stood up, and walked to the window above the strawberry patch.
The house is floating,
he stated in monotone.
It's floating, you guys.
The others laughed. No one even bothered to stand up.
This is how it happens,
he said.
First it starts floating. Then it floats higher and higher until it disappears.
He turned back to the others and stared at them, his eyes wide and unblinking.
It floats higher and higher, higher and higher.
The younger boys were spooked. One stood up and walked to the window. He looked down at the strawberry patch.
I think he's right, guys. The ground is farther away than it was before.
Some of the boys, including Craig, laughed at the statement, but another did not laugh. He followed the younger boy to the window.
He's right,
he exclaimed.
I can see it.
The rest of them jumped up, moving together, and pressed their faces to the glass. The window became foggy with their combined breath. Each of the boys claimed to see the same thing. There was the ground, and there was the strawberry patch. It seemed that they were farther away, but were they really? No one dared to go outside for proof.
I'm scared,
said one of the younger boys. He went back to the couch to lie down, burying his face in a pillow. One by one, the others moved away from the window, but Craig's brother would not leave the spot.
Now it's even farther. It's much farther than before. The house is floating. It's just floating away with us in it. It's getting higher and higher, higher and higher.
Paul Black stood up and returned to the window.
He's right, guys,
he said in a panic.
The strawberries are really far away now.
Compelled to join Paul, the boys found themselves back at the glass. They began talking over one another about how the house was floating away, about how Craig's older brother was right. One boy, named Brandon Catter, stepped away from the others. He'd had enough.
You guys are so stupid. The house isn't floating. It hasn't moved at all. You're all idiots.
But right then and there, the others shrieked and jumped back from the window. They were falling over backwards, scrambling away from something they all saw outside. They scattered, hiding in closets and behind the couch and the big potted plants. Another flash of lightning preceded a rumble of thunder. Brandon went to the window.
What's with you guys?
When he looked outside, he couldn't believe his eyes. Everything below was so tiny, so far away. The strawberry patch was 100, maybe even 1,000 feet down from the window. Brandon fell backward to the floor like a statue. He was out cold, motionless on the carpet. Everyone was silent. The rain outside continued to pound against the glass, the walls, and the roof. The wind had strengthened. The whole house was creaking and groaning, as if it was now just a sail in the sky. After what seemed like an eternity, the boys began to emerge from their hiding places. They gathered around the fallen boy on the thick carpet. He was beginning to come to. Craig's older brother, distant as though in a trance, was the only boy who didn't seem terrified. Craig looked to his brother, then turned to the group with wide eyes.
I think I know what's happening,
he said.
I think I know why the house is floating away.
Why? You tell me what's happening,
demanded one boy.
It's not really floating away. It's just an illusion, a kind of mass suggestion. We've all been hypnotized or something.
Brandon sat up and began to speak softly.
No. I saw it.
He turned to Craig's older brother.
You were right. We are getting higher and higher. Higher and higher.
For a time, no one said anything. None were brave enough to look out the window again. They were all too afraid of what they might see. But they knew they had to, and eventually agreed to do it together. They all stood up, helping Brandon to his feet, went to the rain-soaked pane of glass, and looked down. Out where the grass and the trees, the fence, the porch, the mailbox, and the little strawberry patch had previously been, there was now only an endless gray void. Down in the park. On a hot Sunday in July, brothers Curtis and Scott were spending the afternoon at the park with their friends Danielle and Asia.
Let's go to the playground,
suggested the girls, who were sisters. Curtis and Scott nodded in agreement, and the four headed out along the path through the huge fields of grass. The playground was infamous. It was a 3-story cement jumble of platforms, catwalks, and spiraling metal slides that would burn children if the sun shined on them for too long. At the base of this concrete fortress was a kind of dungeon of dark tunnels that was like a basement below the upper levels. It was all quite old, and the kind of thing that would probably be torn down one day and replaced with something safer. After playfully running to the entrance of the dungeon, the children went through a small arched hole that led into the little maze of passageways. Inside, it was cool and dark, and smelled of sand and urine. No one was ever really bothered by this. It was simply part of the experience. They proceeded on hands and knees through the sand, as the ceiling was low. The children had crawled through the tunnels so many times that they'd memorized every inch and could have done it blindfolded. So when they reached the next corner, everyone was completely stunned by what they saw and stopped dead in their tracks. Something was different. There seemed to be a turn where there had not been one before. The children stared in confusion down the new tunnel.
Wait, this wasn't here last time,
exclaimed Curtis. Danielle shook her head.
No way.
It wasn't? Scott was unsure.
I told you. No way,
Danielle replied.
They changed it or something. How could they change it?
Asked Asia.
It's made of concrete. You can't just change it. You guys are crazy.
They paused, trying to process this puzzling predicament. For several moments, the only sounds came from other children shouting and running on the floors above them. After a while, Asia repeated her statement.
You guys are crazy.
She proceeded on hands and knees down the new tunnel. The others followed. Perhaps they were somehow mistaken. As they moved through the passageway, the children felt a sudden prickling or tingling on their skin, and their hair stood up on end. Then, just as quickly, the sensations were gone. The light in the tunnel brightened a bit as the children rounded a turn and unexpectedly emerged from the structure exactly where they had entered it, which didn't make sense. Somewhere along the way, the sounds of the playground had faded, and everything appeared darker than before, as though the sun had gone behind thick clouds. The group stood up and took in their surroundings. There were no longer any children around, and the park was gray, covered in a thick fog. Where there had once been a sun before, there was now a gigantic crescent moon. The four gazed about in disbelief, then stared at each other. Asia was the first to speak.
What the heck? What happened to all the people?
Danielle joined her.
And the sun? Wasn't it daytime a minute ago? What's going on here?
Asked Curtis.
How could it get dark so fast?
Scott looked around in confusion. Then he pointed to the expanse of grass in the far distance, where there had just moments before been several groups of people.
They all left.
The preteens pivoted around, scanning the fields, the hills, the pavilions, and the playground. There was not a soul to be seen, and it was eerily quiet.
The people went home, said Scott. Maybe because the weather changed.
Asia shook her head.
No, that's crazy.
Even if they all ran as fast as they could to hide while we were inside, we would still be able to see somebody around.
Curtis couldn't understand it.
We could hear them when we were inside.
They were all over the place.
But then the sounds just stopped.
Something weird is going on here, guys. Everyone disappeared. Yeah, right,
Asia chuckled.
There are other kids around. They couldn't have gotten very far.
The girl ran off to the other side of the playground and behind the cement structure. The others followed. She was expecting to see someone, anyone, in the distance. But there was nobody anywhere.
I don't understand,
she said.
There were tons of kids a second ago. Where is everybody?
A breeze swept eerily through the playground. The group could do nothing but stare in every direction. Then, from around the corner, came a rhythmic creaking sound.
Guys, look.
Curtis was now pointing to the swing set. The swings were motionless. All except one, which was vigorously swinging back and forth. They expected to see some kid who had just jumped off, but there was no one there. The four watched in shock as the swing just kept going. It didn't slow down or stop. It was as if something invisible was moving it. The sight of it caused them to take several steps back. Scott began to cry.
Curtis, what's happening? Where are Mom and Dad?
The children hadn't even noticed that they were huddled together in fear. There was only one place to go now, back down the path toward the opposite end of the enormous park. There, in the distance, was the softball building. This was a green, circular structure made up of bleachers and a scorekeeper's room at the very top, which overlooked the 4 playing fields surrounding it. They knew that their parents should be there, playing volleyball on the grass nearby. They would be able to explain everything. After a quick glimpse at each other, the 4 took off running, back down the path toward the softball building. When they came around the corner, the big field of grass next to the structure came into view. But grass was all there was. The adults were not there. No one was there. And neither were the volleyball net, the lawn chairs, or the coolers with their last name stenciled on top. The place was deserted. Scott fell to his knees. Danielle just froze. Curtis looked to Asia, who, at 12, was the oldest.
Why would they leave?
He asked her, almost in tears. Asia began rationalizing.
There must be a good explanation,
she said, trying to keep calm in front of the younger kids.
We just have to find somebody. Let's head to the road and wave down a car.
Curtis could see from the corner of his eye that the parking lot was now empty. He looked away quickly, unwilling to process the sight.
Let's go in there first,
he said, motioning to the big green building in the center of the softball diamonds.
We were just at the snack bar. There must be people there.
Everyone gazed toward the scorekeeper's lookout room at the top. They couldn't see anyone inside. It all seemed somewhat dirtier than before.
Maybe it's killer bees, or some kind of chemical spill,
Danielle suggested.
Maybe everyone found out except us. Chemicals. Killer bees?
Her older sister thought it was ridiculous.
Mom and Dad wouldn't just leave us.
Maybe it was the tunnel, said Scott quietly, who was lying motionless in the grass. But nobody wanted to think about that. It was too wild an idea. There had to be a better explanation. They just needed to find an adult. After turning on his side, Scott spoke again.
The grass doesn't have a smell anymore.
Curtis pulled his little brother up off the ground. Then, without a word, the children looked to one another and began moving quickly through the fog toward the softball building. They didn't know what to expect, especially when they thought back to the swing set which was burned into their memories. There was no doubt that something was very wrong. Scott's words about the tunnel were beginning to stir in their minds. Maybe the answer really was back at the playground, but none of them could imagine going back there anytime soon. With strange thoughts looping in their brains, they moved through the entrance and into the concrete hollow beneath the bleachers. There they came to the concession stand, where they had been only a short time before. But no one was there. The stand was closed, and it looked as though it hadn't been open for years. There was no food or drink in sight. Everything was lifeless and empty. Nothing seemed real anymore. It all felt like a bad dream. A nearby staircase led outside to the bleachers above. They climbed all the way up to the scorekeeper's lookout room. The windows were all broken and dusty. It, too, looked long abandoned. It wasn't until the children began to circle the lookout tower, scanning the area for signs of life, that they finally saw something out in the southeast field. There in the distance were people. People playing baseball. Without any thought or hesitation, Asia called out,
Hey! Hey, you down there! Where did everybody go?
Her voice echoed through the complex. Then it was silent. The figures down below stopped. Slowly, they began to turn toward the four children. The baseball players were dressed in odd, tattered clothing, and their faces were darkened in the strange moonlit fog. They stood there, eerily quiet. After a long pause, one of them finally called back,
Go home!
A different voice, this one weaker and more gravelly, also called out,
You don't belong here! Get out!
The children looked to one another for cues of what to do next, but they had no idea what was happening. Then the person holding the baseball bat let out a horrific, blood-curdling shriek.
Go home, fleshheads!
The voice was utterly inhuman. As the petrified children watched, the players began slowly moving toward them. As they lumbered closer, they began to moan. Then they moved even faster, and before the children could even react, the shadowy figures were running up the bleachers, screaming and shrieking. Suddenly much closer, they could now see the faces of the players, which were skeletal and disfigured like the faces of the dead. Asia grabbed her little sister and threw her toward the exit. Without a thought, the four found themselves instinctually running, faster than ever before, back the way they had come. They rushed down the steps into the hollow beneath the bleachers, darted past the concession stand and toward the exit. All the while, they could hear the pounding footsteps of the ghoulish figures they had seen only moments before. They were right behind the children. They were coming. Looking back, they saw the terrible beings erupt from the building, all carrying baseball bats. They had shark mouths of sharp, barred teeth, scowling in hideous anger. When they reached the trail, the four could see the hill above where they had been playing not long ago. Coming down the slope were two more figures. But these beings wore black hooded cloaks and seemed to glide down the hill as if floating just above the ground. The entities were moving at high speed directly toward them. There was no time to process the sight. The children could do nothing but run back toward the playground, screaming in terror as they tore down the path in their sand-filled sneakers. The swing was still moving when they reached the playground, but it began to slow down as they approached. The transparent image of a boy wearing a red hoodie suddenly appeared sitting upon it, as if he had been there the entire time. The child pulled back his hood and revealed his face. It, too, was the face of death. The boy's eyes were sunken and clouded, and his skin was falling right off the bone. He looked at them as though he was the one who was afraid, then instantly disappeared. The playground was a dead end. They all knew they wouldn't be able to climb the fence to the subdivision before those things reached them. There was nowhere left to run. A strange wind began to blow all around. Scott suddenly cried out,
We have to get back! Back to the other side! Back through the tunnel!
They somehow knew at that moment that he was right. It was their only chance. They made a beeline straight for the entrance to the tunnels. The baseball players and cloaked figures were right behind them. They could hear the inhuman shrieks and screams only seconds away. Into the cement dungeon once again, the children scrambled frantically through the sand on hands and knees. The sound of their panicked breaths and cries reverberated off the concrete as they searched for the new tunnel. And there it was once again, the same new tunnel. They flew feverishly through the passage, all the while tormented by wails from the ghouls in pursuit. Light appeared suddenly ahead. The same static electricity was felt, and the horrible sounds became muffled and began to fade away. It was as though they were waking up from a nightmare, waking up to the voices of children playing all around them. Something was happening. Something had changed again. Afraid that they were being followed, Asia looked back to where the new tunnel had been. It was now only a blank cement wall. Together they crawled to the exit, shaking and in tears, unsure of what would be waiting for them. The group emerged and got to their feet, then stumbled about in a daze, desperately wondering if they were still in danger. But they were not. Instead, they found themselves back in the park, surrounded by happy children and families, on a hot Sunday in July. Camper. It was a beautiful, starry summer night, and the Weston family was gathered in their cozy old truck camper in the mountains. The adults were sitting around the table, playing cards and listening to music, when Aunt Cass spoke. "We should all go on a starlight walk," she said. Mother, Father, and Uncle Brent liked the idea, but the two young brothers, Tommy and Mark, were tired from a long day of swimming in the lake, and more in the mood to stay back in the camper alone. The adults allowed this, and they stood up to leave together. "We'll be gone for about an hour," said their mother. The grown-ups then departed, the sound of their voices trailing away into the darkness. Soon, only the chirping of crickets remained. With no adults around, the boys were free to do whatever they wanted. They were rolling around on top of each other, throwing pillows and jumping all over the place. It seemed they weren't as tired as they let on. But soon, the exhaustion did catch up with them, so they turned off most of the lights and retired to the bed above the cab. Tommy grabbed a flashlight from the little cabinet near his pillow and began to tell ghost stories to his younger brother. The first story was about a haunted schoolhouse. It wasn't very scary. The second story, about a babysitter being called on the phone by some crazy person who was actually upstairs the entire time, was much better. At about midnight, it was Mark's turn to tell a story. But halfway through, he was interrupted by a strange vibration that shook everything in the camper. This was accompanied by a low-pitched hum. It lasted only a few moments, and then stopped.
What was that?
Asked Mark.
I don't know. Probably an airplane. I don't think so. Maybe it was an earthquake?
Tommy got up and walked to the door, with Mark following closely behind. He opened it and looked around outside. Above them was a light in the starry night sky.
See, it's just an airplane, like I said,
proclaimed the older brother.
It doesn't look like an airplane to me,
Mark replied. The light seemed to pass by and disappear somewhere behind the trees. The brothers forgot all about it and returned to bed, where they continued telling stories. At 12:30, the adults still hadn't returned back to the campground. Tommy was concerned.
Where are they? They should have been back by now.
Shortly after, there came another sound. This time, it was a high-pitched buzzing, followed by the sound of tree branches snapping outside. The boys looked at each other.
What was that?
Cried Tommy.
Tommy? I'm scared,
said Mark, frightened. The older boy tried to stay calm. He peeked through all the little curtains that surrounded them up there in the bed, but he could see only the silhouette of trees faintly illuminated by starlight.
Tommy?
Mark asked his brother.
Will you go lock the door?
Tommy rolled his eyes, but agreed. He climbed down in his pajamas, and when he reached the middle of the camper, secured the lock on the door.
Maybe it's a bear,
he said, half joking, as he returned to the loft.
It can't get us in here, can it?
Tommy laughed.
No.
Tommy wasn't quite sure what the sounds were. He and Mark soon agreed to close all the curtains. For the longest time, there was only silence. The boys had stopped telling stories and were now just listening. When a new sound finally came, they instantly broke into a cold sweat. This time, it was a scratching coming from the rear window of the camper, followed by an unexplainable high-pitched squeak. Then the sound stopped. Mark's eyes were wide with fear.
Tommy,
he whispered loudly. Shh! The boys listened as the weird noises started up again and began to move around the side of the camper, closer to the front. When the sounds finally reached the cab, they stopped. Bodies tense and sweaty, the pair lay motionless on the mattress, trying not to make a sound. Tommy whispered into Mark's ear, "I'm gonna have a look outside." He took a deep breath, trying to build up the courage to open the curtain. It took him a moment, but finally he went for it. He reached out and pulled back the old red fabric. Through the little pane of glass, staring back at him from the darkness, was a hideous face. Tommy froze when he saw it. The unknown thing before him filled his entire view. It was all white, and it looked like a giant insect, only with a long, serrated, saw-like duck bill and dark horizontal slits for eyes. The face was lit by a bizarre, glowing, multicolored strand that hung around the creature's neck. Tommy tore the curtain closed. He screamed out in terror, but no sound came. He could not even breathe. He was paralyzed with fear. "What did you see?" his little brother whispered. Tommy grabbed Mark, pulling him into the corner of the loft, and threw the blanket over both of them. He held his little brother tightly, trying not to breathe. It was all he could do. Mark could feel his older brother shaking violently. "Tommy, what did you see?" But the older brother did not respond. Then it happened. Someone or something was at the locked door. Tommy held his breath even tighter. The door was somehow opening. Tommy felt his body turn to ice. There was a pause, followed by footsteps in the darkness. Someone or something was now in the camper with them. Mark began to whimper. The brothers held each other tighter and tighter as the footsteps approached the loft. Suddenly, the lights came on, and through the fabric of the blanket, someone could be seen moving toward them. Tommy had never been as afraid as he was at that moment. "This can't be real," thought the boy. "This has to be some kind of dream." The loft curtains were yanked back and the blanket torn from the bed. Tommy and Mark both screamed and screamed. But when they looked up, the boys saw only their parents and their aunt and uncle looking back. They had finally returned from their walk. The children reached out to their mother and father, clawing at them in desperate terror. But as they tried to embrace their parents, they sensed that something was not right. They looked up at the grown-ups who towered above them. They all had the same strange blank look on their faces. Their eyes were empty and unfamiliar. They stared down at the children with a dark and hollow gaze. Then, together, their mother, father, aunt, and uncle opened their mouths, and out came a low, guttural voice, speaking in unison as one.
"It's time."
Creatures. Your parents always said there were no such things as monsters. But what do they know? Unigoshi. Larry Whitefeather was riding in the bed of an old pickup truck next to his cousin. His father and uncle were up front in the cab. It was a long drive home from the big high school football game, but the desert air was warm and dry and felt good. Along the way, Larry's father, who was driving, turned onto a dirt road.
Boys,
He said loudly through the cab's open rear window.
I'm taking a shortcut to get us home before it gets too late.
Upon hearing this, Larry's uncle began to argue with his father. "We should not go through the ranch," he said. "Many evil spirits inhabit that place. The Yinaldu Shi'ai dwell there." His father laughed out loud.
Ha! That's crazy. I don't believe in such things.
Ignoring his brother, the man turned the wheel and drove the truck through a cattle gate, then down a new section of bumpy dirt road. The sun had set and the headlights were now on, making the desert road ahead appear shadowy and ominous. "What did he say?" asked Larry's cousin. "He said there are Unigoshi out here," replied Larry. The two boys in the back became very nervous. They had both heard stories from their grandfather about the Unigoshi. Some people called them skinwalkers. It was said that they were once medicine men from their own tribe, but now they walked the path of the witchery way and used black magic to transform into animals. Some said that they even killed their own family members in sacrifice. They would cut off a finger from the dead and swallow it. The finger would become trapped in the throat of the sorcerer and glow brightly. "Don't worry, Larry. Those are just stories meant to scare children," said his cousin, trying to act brave. As the truck rolled down the dusty road, it grew darker still, until the travelers could no longer see even the outline of the red rock hills flanking the little valley. Farther along, Larry thought he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but when he focused on it, there was nothing there. Shortly afterward, his cousin claimed to see a coyote in the distance. The boys noticed that Larry's uncle had begun watching the mirrors of the truck very closely. He then turned his head, scanning the darkness of the desert behind the vehicle. "Something is following us," they heard him tell his brother. "You should speed up." But Larry's father only laughed once more. It wasn't long before Larry saw them. They were several hundred feet behind the truck. Low to the ground were two strange lights.
Look!
His cousin called out, pointing.
Something's there!
Soon everyone in the truck could see them. Larry's uncle was worried, and he began shouting at Larry's father to speed up. This time he did, all the way up to 40 miles per hour. But after several moments at this speed, the lights only seemed to grow closer. Larry and his cousin could see what seemed to be two sets of eyes accompanying the lights. Larry's father sped up even more. Now he was going close to 50 miles per hour. The road had become extremely bumpy, and the dust cloud in the rear grew larger. Through the dust and the darkness, the approaching creatures became clearer still. The lights were coming from what appeared to be large coyotes or wolves, and they were glowing from inside their skin, from the throats of the obscured creatures.
They're chasing us!
Cried Larry's uncle.
We have to go faster!
Father could now see them clearly in the rearview mirror.
That's impossible! They can't run as fast as the truck!
But they were getting closer and had almost reached the rear of the vehicle. Father sped up again, this time to 65. The truck was swerving along the dirt road, and the terrified boys in the back were now being tossed all around. The creatures were now directly behind them. The boys could see that they were running at an incredible speed. The legs of the giant dog creatures were a blur, and their eyes and throats glowed like lanterns. Helpless in the exposed truck bed, Larry and his cousin began screaming, pressing their bodies against the rear of the cab, clutching the frame of the little rear window. They were desperate to get as far away from the edges of the truck as possible. The creatures were now right up alongside the vehicle. They could be seen clearly, which horrified the passengers of the swerving truck. They were animals, but with the faces of men. Men with snouts and sharp teeth, all illuminated in an eerie yellow light that shot out from the throat. In a panic, Larry forced himself through the little cab window and squirmed into the truck cab, screaming for his life. He landed right on the shifter, and the vehicle slowed as his father fought to regain control. Larry's cousin, still in the back, watched in horror as the creatures suddenly leapt into the air directly into the bed before him. As they landed, they both vanished in an instant and were gone. The main road then appeared, and the group eventually made their way home. The next day, Larry's cousin began to feel ill. Over several weeks, his condition only grew worse. He complained of nightmares and stomach pain. He had difficulty breathing. He began acting strangely, had cold sweats, and was constantly vomiting. A month later, Larry received the news that his cousin had died. Clouds. Lori Travers and her son, Chris, were bringing in the groceries from the car. Up until then, it had been a beautiful summer day. But ominous clouds were moving in, and the sunny sky had turned gray and dismal. When all the brown paper bags had been brought in and set on the countertop, Chris began searching ravenously for the dill pickles that he was always craving.
Mom, where are the pickles?
Lori turned to her son, worried.
Did I not get them?
Chris looked like he was about to cry.
Mom, you told me if I passed the spelling test that I could have pickles. I know.
After a long pause, she groaned, grabbed her keys, only moments after setting them down, and headed back through the door to the car. Chris was pleased. It seemed he would be getting his pickles after all.
I'll be back, she said. And you better be telling the truth about that spelling test.
On her way out, Lori saw that the clouds above were oddly shaped and moving in all directions. Everything looked so strange up there. She got into the car and headed down the hill toward the grocery store. She took the back entrance through the alleyway, just like she always did, parked in the same spot as before, and then made her way across the parking lot still watching the clouds. Inside the store, she had no problem walking straight to the pickle aisle. She grabbed her son's favorite brand, paid at the checkout line, and then headed back to her vehicle. The clouds above were even more peculiar now. Lori Travers started up the car and headed back through the parking lot to the rear alleyway. She drove slowly down the narrow alley as she always did. It was then and there that she saw it through the windshield in the sky above. It was like something out of a dream. She could not even process the image. It made no sense whatsoever. From behind a cloud peered a bizarre object. It was a gigantic, long-necked thing with a strange, fanned-out, bulbous head. It was shaped like an old desk lamp or horn, only bafflingly colossal in size. It peeked around the corner of the cloud, froze for a second or two, and then retracted, disappearing completely. Lori Travers never told anyone about what she saw that day in the clouds. Venetian blinds. Judy was 16 years old. She often babysat the McClellan children, Pete and Marcy, on Saturday nights. She usually enjoyed babysitting, although sometimes the young children could be a handful. On Thursday, the phone rang. Mr. McClellan was on the other line.
Can you babysit this weekend?
He asked.
It would be overnight.
Judy accepted, and when Saturday came, she drove her old blue sedan to the McClellan's house. She was given a list of instructions, including the children's bedtimes and what they were and were not allowed to eat or watch on TV. Then Mr. and Mrs. McClellan said goodbye and left. For the next few hours, Judy and the children played restaurant with toy food items, then they all danced and sang. Finally, the group built different artistic structures out of couch cushions. Each structure had a name: flower, horse, box, longhouse, and tower. After building the formations, Judy and the children would jump in and destroy them, pretending to be stuntmen. At 11 o'clock, it was time for the children to go to sleep. They had already convinced the young woman to let them stay up an extra hour, but this time she insisted. She tucked Pete and Marcy into their beds, told them a story, and said goodnight. Then she curled up on the couch with a book that she'd checked out from the school library. Judy was about halfway through the book when there came a knock on the door. She was startled for a moment, but composed herself and then went to answer it. "It's pretty late," she thought. "I wonder who it could be at this hour." She opened the front door, and to her surprise, she found that no one was there. Only darkness. Judy figured it must be some teenagers or kids out on a Saturday night playing tricks on people. But she was unnerved enough to lock the doors, if only to feel more comfortable. At 12:05, Judy was back on the couch, reading, when there came a second knock. The babysitter was more afraid this time. She snuck quietly to the window and looked outside toward the unlit porch. There, in the darkness, standing before the door, was a shadowy figure. It was the shape of a person, but there was something very off about the sight. The image of the being was elongated, strange, and distorted. She quickly ducked out of view. What had she just seen? She hadn't gotten a very good look at it. And it was dark after all. Surely it was only her imagination. Judy briefly considered turning the porch light on, but she was too afraid of what she might see. Carefully crawling below the window, she reached up and closed the blinds. All Judy could do at this point was attempt to put it out of her mind. The doors were locked, and that meant they were safe. Nothing could get inside. She convinced herself once more that this whole thing must be someone playing a trick on her, and she went back to the living room. At 12:15, the children emerged from their bedroom, tears running down their faces.
"Judy!"
cried Pete, pointing to the bedroom.
"There's something outside the window!"
Marcy exclaimed.
"It's trying to get us!"
The children grabbed at the babysitter, whining and trembling. Judy was concerned, but she tried to be calm and rational.
It's probably just some stupid kids playing tricks on us, she said. If we ignore them, they'll probably go away.
The children climbed onto the couch with Judy and clenched her body in fear. She had already closed all the blinds and curtains in the living room. As long as the doors were locked, there was nothing to be afraid of. At 1 o'clock, when both children were asleep at Judy's side, there came a scratching sound from the window nearby. Judy froze. The scratching went on for several moments before she ultimately went to the kitchen to find a large knife. She figured it was the smartest thing to do. But after she came back with the weapon, the scratching from the covered window stopped. At 1:52, after a long period of silence, there came a new commotion from above. At first, Judy thought it could be thunder, as a storm was brewing overhead. The wind was picking up, and rain was beginning to pepper the windows and walls of the house. But it soon became clear that it was something else entirely. This was a creaking sound, followed by a series of pounding noises, as though someone was walking up on the roof or crawling around in the attic. It was loud enough to wake the sleeping children.
What is it, Judy?
Marcy whispered.
What's that sound?
Asked Pete. Judy tried once again to stay calm.
Probably a raccoon or something.
The little girl turned to Judy, trembling.
It's the Venetian blind man.
Shut up!
Pete hissed.
There's no such thing.
You've seen him too, Pete!
Judy was confused.
Who is the Venetian blind man?
Marcy hesitated.
He's a scary monster who looks through the windows, sometimes at night. Mom and Dad don't believe us. Pete saw him too. He saw him a long time ago.
That was just a dream, Marcy. It's someone playing tricks, just like Judy says. No! It's the monster!
Just then, a great white light from outside flashed through all the windows. An enormous clap of thunder rumbled through the house, shaking even the light bulb in the lamp beside the couch. As the strange sounds on the roof continued, Judy, Marcy, and Pete looked with fear to the ceiling above. They held each other tightly. Several minutes passed, and the footfalls on the roof continued. Back and forth, back and forth. They were heavy. Much heavier than any animal that could possibly be up there. At this point, Judy had finally had enough.
That's it,
she said.
I'm calling the police.
The children were too afraid to move. They stayed on the couch wrapped in a blanket while the babysitter went to the phone and dialed the police. But nothing happened. There was no dial tone. This phone must be broken, the girl thought. She hurried into the master bedroom to find another, but it too was dead. It was as if the line had been severed. Could the storm have done that? A horrible realization came over the girl. The house was completely cut off from the outside world. She was all alone. Judy heard one of the children cry out her name once again, so she hurried back to the living room, clutching the knife tightly in her sweaty hand. Marcy was still on the couch, but Pete was standing at the nearest window. He had opened the curtains and the Venetian blinds. He was staring at something through the rain-laden glass, as if someone was standing before him just beyond the pane.
Pete!
She cried out, rushing to the boy. He seemed to be in some kind of trance. A flash of lightning illuminated just enough for Judy to see the smallest glimpse of something in the corner of her eye. She told herself that it must have been the branches of a tree. The babysitter didn't want to look out the window. She quickly shut the blinds and tore closed the curtains, pulling Pete away. She led the children to a spot behind the recliner that was far from any windows. They all ducked down and hid. A rumble of thunder passed through the area once more. Judy was fighting with herself. Part of her knew that something was out there, trying to get inside the house, but she couldn't accept what it might be. Another part was telling her to grow up, that there was nothing at all out there, that she was the same as Marcy and Pete, just a child with an overactive imagination. But the fearful part of her was beginning to completely take over.
Pete,
she whispered, wrapping the boy in a brown afghan.
Why did you open the curtains?
But Pete didn't respond. He was just staring into space.
Pete! What's wrong with him, Judy?
Asked Marcy, sobbing. Judy ran her fingers through the boy's hair and rubbed his hands with her own.
I don't know.
She didn't know what to do next.
Pete? Pete, are you asleep? Are you sleepwalking, honey? Wake up.
But Pete would not respond. At 2:33, the sounds returned to the rooftop. This time it was like horses were trotting around up there. The storm was raging overhead. For a moment, the strange noises stopped. But then came an even more terrible sound, this time from the chimney. It was a low growl that sounded neither animal nor human. Demonic rumbling grunts and snarls reverberated down the metal flue. Judy's first instinct was to stand up with the knife in hand and scream at the fireplace.
Go away!
It was around that time that a peculiar, disconnected look began to appear on Marcy's face. The babysitter didn't know what to do next. Surely nothing could come down the chimney. Or could it? Frantically, she searched the room, hoping to find something to block the opening. But when she looked back, she discovered that both of the children were on the move, running in different directions.
Pete! Marcy, where are you going?
At first, she thought the children were running away to hide, but when she followed Pete through the dining room and into the kitchen, she found him at the front door. He had unlocked it, and it was beginning to open. She gasped in horror, jerking the boy away violently, both of them falling on their backs to the floor. She slammed the door shut with a downward kick, then reached up to quickly refasten the lock. Through the little window in the door, she could clearly see something pass by in the dark. This time, she caught a glimpse of the profile. It was the most horrifying thing she had ever seen. Something like a horrible demonic monkey face, atop a grotesquely tall and slender frame, had just been brought to light by a flash from the chaotic skies above. She fought back the urge to simply collapse then and there and began dragging Pete back into the living room. But he was fighting the babysitter, spitting and flopping around in a bizarre display. In the frenzy, she dropped the knife onto the linoleum floor. Another flash of lightning, followed by an explosion of thunder, filled the babysitter with terror. In tears, tightly clutching the boy with both hands, she called out to his younger sister.
Marcy! Marcy, where are you?
Pete suddenly cried out. His voice was rasp and alien.
Have to let him in! The Venetian blind man!
He was clawing and biting at Judy. She couldn't imagine what had gotten into him, but it terrified her beyond words. When Judy had finally dragged Pete back into the living room, she saw the boy's sister.
Marcy, why did you...
The babysitter's words stopped mid-sentence. Marcy was at the back door. The little girl had opened it. Judy looked up and then completely froze. There, standing in the darkness of the doorway, was the Venetian blind man. Wigglers. During an especially hot summer in 1981, a man found himself hopelessly lost on a back road in rural northwest Florida. He was traveling for work far from home, and he didn't have a map. As he searched for the main highway, he took a turn too fast and lost control of his vehicle. He crashed into a ditch and became stuck. When he got out of the car to inspect his surroundings, he saw that he was beside an old farmhouse. There, in the distance, was a man working in the fields. He approached the man and explained his situation. The farmer was not much older than himself, although he was missing most of his teeth and spoke with a strong southern accent. He told the stranded visitor that he didn't have a phone, but said that his brother could bring his tractor around in the morning to tow the car back into town. Leaning against his propped-up pitchfork, the farmer then began to proudly describe his livelihood, which was his surrounding worm farm.
40 years ago, there weren't no wigglers round here. Not like these wigglers, anyway. All we had around here is what they call the orchard worm wiggler. Don't know how they accumulated, but they all went away one night. Never came back, just up and left. So I got some different ones.
As the traveler listened, the strange farmer adjusted his greasy old cap and went on about his worms.
Used to be lots of normal wigglers round here. But I shows you the different ones. I got these from South Florida.
He led the stranded man down a swampy stretch of property to a huge pen filled with mud. There before him were gigantic living creatures, enormous worms coming out of the ground and going back in. They were larger in size than the giant anacondas in the Amazon. The sound of the soil being churned and tilled by the beasts filled the air, and the ground shook beneath their feet.
These here is the new wigglers. These wigglers is growing wigglers.
The traveler took several steps back. He was shocked and terrified by the sight. He paused in disbelief, trying to collect himself, then asked the farmer how the worms could possibly have become so large. The strange man did not answer at first, but rather hobbled over to an old broken-down shed. He returned moments later, holding something that looked like a mason jar. It was filled, most of the way up, with white powder. He showed it to the traveler.
Fell out of the sky, it did. It's what done it. This here's growing sand.
The farmer explained, in his odd way, that upon examining the peculiar jar which had fallen from the sky, he had spilled just a bit of the white substance onto the ground. The next day, worms had gathered in the spot, only they were suddenly much larger than they should have been. After that, the farmer began giving the worms a teaspoon of the sand every day, and he saw that they became even larger. A week later, it was a tablespoon a day, and again they grew larger. Then it was 2, then 4, then 8. Every time he gave the worms the white powder, he found them twice as large the next morning.
These wigglers is mean, and they keeps getting meaner,
exclaimed the farmer, motioning to the pen.
These wigglers ate up my dogs, ate up my chickens, farm cats, even an old donkey down by the fence. Came right up out the ground and took the beast. They tried to eat me up too, but I'm too smart. But they's mean. You best watch out around these wigglers.
The traveler observed the gigantic worms as they wriggled and writhed in the mud. They beat their massive heads and tails against the ground so violently that it made the earth rumble all around them.
Today's the day, though. 16 tablespoons is 1 cup, said Mama. That's what I'm gonna give 'em now.
The man suddenly opened the jar and dumped all of its contents right into the pen. It was much more than a cup. The mammoth worms quickly became agitated, and they all swarmed toward the spot where the sand had been poured. The white spot disappeared, churned into the earth by the strange creatures. The farmer, holding the jar in his weathered and dirty hands, passed it over to the traveler.
It's got writing on it. Never did learn to read no words. Brother Bill neither. You got to tell me the words so I knows what it says. You reads it so I can tell Bill what it says.
At that moment, a horrible sound came from the beasts, and in an instant the old farmer was being pulled down into the dirt. An enormous wriggling worm wrapped around the man's body, and he was sucked into the soil, screaming. The traveler fell backward, scrambling to get away. He climbed to his feet and ran as fast as he could back to his broken-down car. When he reached it, he climbed inside and caught his breath. But the car wasn't going anywhere. All the man could do was look at the empty jar in his hands, which did indeed have writing on it. It read, BV-29, property of U.S. government. Coal black. Stephanie and her cousin, Kelly Rose, were spending the weekend at their uncle's summer cabin in the woods. They were happy to get away from school and relax for a change. All throughout the evening, the young women sang and danced and spoke of their childhoods together. At midnight, the pair began to feel sleepy from their long day of travel and play. They retired to their beds, Stephanie in the upstairs loft, and Kelly Rose on the sofa sleeper near the front door. Some time later, Stephanie awoke. She was covered in sweat and felt sick to her stomach. Something was wrong. She thought she heard a noise coming from outside in the forest. As she listened, the front door opened. Then came heavy footsteps, a rustling, and finally the sound of Kelly Rose screaming out from her bed below. Stephanie found herself instinctively leaping out of bed and grabbing a flashlight. She shined the light over the railing and down to the living room below. With particles of dust thickening the eerie beam of light, she could clearly see Kelly Rose in some type of struggle on the pull-out bed. There was something on top of her, something that the light was passing right through. It was a black mass, like a thick shadow in the shape of a man. A hulking figure made of what almost looked like coal, only transparent. Stephanie could not breathe. A horrifyingly vague, bobbing head and face seemed to stare directly into the beam and right at her. Then the creature completely vanished and was gone. All that was left was the sound of Kelly Rose below, screaming and screaming. In the days following the incident at the cabin, Kelly Rose became very ill. Stephanie visited her each day, and each day she seemed worse. She was nauseous, pale, covered with welts and bruises, and she had a high fever. But mostly she complained of sharp shooting pains throughout her body. Stephanie decided to take her cousin to the hospital. The doctors gave Kelly Rose an examination and took a series of X-rays. When the images were finally developed, they revealed something that no one could explain. Hundreds of sewing needles embedded all throughout the girl's body. The Whirling Dervish. It was the spring of 1963. The Wilson family lived a few miles from town in a farmhouse surrounded by an endless expanse of cornfields. The boys, along with father, grandfather, and sometimes Uncle Rick, worked hard all day in the fields. The girls spent their time milking the cows, feeding the animals, and gathering eggs. At lunchtime, Uncle Rick would often tell stories to the younger family members. A popular story was one that he and grandfather claimed to have actually happened. It seemed that a long time ago, there was a group of 3 brothers. They were the meanest, most evil men around. They practiced black magic and witchcraft. When several missing children were found murdered, the people in the nearby town lynched the 3 men, hanging them all from a black walnut tree. As the nooses were placed around their necks, the men swore revenge on the town. They were executed without a trial and buried in unmarked paupers' graves. After lunch, the afternoon of farm work went on. It was then that the sky began to grow cloudy and gray.
"The storm's coming,"
grandfather said.
"Gonna be a big one."
In the flat Oklahoma fields, the Wilson family could see in any direction for miles and miles. And now, off in the distance, they could see clearly that the big one was coming. Father stood straight up from his work in the soil and faced the darkening sky to the southwest. It was still a ways off, but it was coming. Everyone, the entire Wilson family, stopped whatever they were doing and turned to face the same direction. They watched as a gigantic thunderstorm brewed and churned violently. It was growing larger and moving toward the farm. Soon came the booming thunder and howling wind.
Time to hunker down,
Father called out. Everyone ran to the house. In the kitchen, the family gathered around the front window and watched as the gigantic black cloud moved closer. Lightning and thunder were flashing and crashing all around them. Soon, from the thunderhead, a shape descended. It looked like a gigantic ruffled curtain that hung from the bottom of the storm. It was moving violently in all directions. Then a new shape formed, and the cloud began to lower. This was a black cone-shaped cloud that was rotating and twisting like a snake in the sky. In the distance, an upward explosion of dust and debris rose up from the ground.
Ma!
Father yelled.
It's a tornado!
The family watched for a moment as the elephant trunk-like thing grew larger and larger, moving closer and closer to the farm. Then Uncle Rick motioned for everyone to get out of the house and down into the root cellar. Crossing the front yard, the children watched in horror as the old pickup truck in the driveway began to roll away and then lift off the ground. They made a mad dash together, but by the time the family had reached the entrance to the cellar, the funnel was right on top of them, bringing with it a sound like 100 freight trains. They hurried down to safety just as everything around them was enveloped by the vortex. The men fought hard to close the heavy doors behind them. Father and Uncle Rick clutched the handle, battling the powerful winds, while Ma and Grandfather comforted the frightened children. Soon the ground and the doors were shaking so violently, and the roar was so deafening that even the screams of the youngsters could not be heard. This went on for several terrifying moments. But eventually, the commotion died down, and the doors to the cellar were opened. The family emerged into a dull and decimated wasteland. The farmhouse was gone. So too were the barns and the outbuildings. The animals were scattered dead all around them, the fields stripped clean. In the distance, they saw that the terrible black funnel was even larger now and heading straight toward the center of town. They watched as the storm roared into the main street and huge pieces of debris began exploding into the air. The town was being completely destroyed by the twister. It was then that the Wilson family encountered the most frightening sight they had ever laid their eyes upon. Rotating in the dark and churning curtain-shaped mass above the funnel were 3 gigantic distorted faces made out of clouds. Christmas creatures. In mid-December, late at night, from out the flue there comes a sight. First transparent, later clear, next you smell them, then you hear. Tiny whizzing humming sounds, above your head then on the ground. You squint and soon you see their form, which vanishes upon the morn. Not once captured on photograph, this claim will cause most folk to laugh. Seen mostly by young boys and girls, the sight would make men's minds unfurl. They're fourth-dimensional machines, although they are alive, it seems. Do not let them inside your head, nor in your bathtub or your bed. They cause you to break out in wheels and give you headaches, fevers, chills. The objects, unaware of us, cling to our skin like grains of dust. They're shaped in many different ways, like arrows, spiders, TV trays. They sometimes sparkle in the sun. When brown, you know it's time to run. They do not know of Santa Claus, nor obey scientific laws. They do not know of Jesus Christ or Mother Mary's sacrifice. It is only coincidence that they all congregate like this. But mid-December, late at night, come Christmas creatures, and they bite. Leftovers. Weird tales that don't fit the mold. The Horde. Two elderly brothers, Hardy and Oscar, lived in a 4-story townhouse that loomed over the city street. Over the years, the wealthy and retired old men had seen their once tranquil neighborhood fill with crime and poverty. The two became increasingly paranoid, and as they looked out their windows, they often believed they could see menacing figures who robbed old women in the daytime and lurked in shadows at night. Time went on, and the brothers left their house less and less frequently. Finally, they stopped going out in the daytime altogether. They quit paying their bills, and the water, electrical, and gas were shut off completely. At some point, the older brother, Oscar, fell ill. He could no longer care for himself, and he needed Hardy to look after him constantly. Hardy only left the house at night, sneaking around in an old bathrobe and gathering food, water, and objects from the neighborhood. Rumors began to spread about what the two strange men were doing all alone in the spooky old mansion on the corner. Crowds gathered outside the house, and teenagers threw rocks at the windows. Some believed that the townhouse was filled with money and treasure, so burglars often tried to break inside. This caused the brothers to become even more paranoid. Hardy boarded up all the windows and doors, completely shutting the men off from the outside world. The brothers did not pay taxes on the house for many years. As a result, the police came to repossess the property. They found it impossible to enter because the front door was completely barricaded from the inside. Once again, a crowd gathered. Hardy eventually came to the door, and through the mail slot he delivered an envelope filled with thousands of dollars in cash. With the money was a note stating that the pair just wanted to be left alone. For a time, the request was granted. A few years later, the police began to receive phone calls about a terrible smell coming from the house. But when they arrived to investigate, no one answered the door. The police had finally had enough, and they decided to cut right through the entrance. Behind the door, they found a barricade of garbage. As they tunneled through, they discovered that the house was filled from top to bottom with mountains of trash and clutter. Stacks of old newspapers, bottles, and tin cans surrounded them. There were rusty bicycles, pianos, pieces of furniture, mannequins, cameras, carriages, and even an entire Model T car. The police called out for the brothers, but there was no response. A strange and sour odor filled the entirety of the dark brownstone mansion. Moving from room to room was difficult and dangerous. The house was a maze of interwoven tunnels made of junk and debris, and Hardy had set numerous booby traps throughout the building to prevent any intruder from reaching the inmost dens. As they made their way carefully through the traps, the police finally came to the upstairs room where the smell was strongest. It was there, after digging for several hours, that they found the bodies of the two brothers. They discovered the remains of Hardy first. He had been crushed to death by his own booby trap of garbage. His older brother, who had been paralyzed and blind for years, was lying only 10 feet away. Oscar, unable to move or help Hardy in any way, had died of starvation.
Bleeny Nugs. Renee was at the local grocery store. She shopped there every Sunday, and her routine never changed. She walked to the produce department just like always to gather tomatoes, onions, and a head of lettuce. Then she moved one aisle over for a loaf of bread and some milk.
When she reached the meat department, she noticed a strange man behind a small booth. He wore odd clothing and had an oversized head with no visible neck. He was singing, and he held something in his hand that she could not make out. There was a handmade sign above him that read, "Bleeny Nugs."
Bleeny Nugs, Bleeny Nugs, Bleeny long and true. Bleeny Nugs, take them home with you.
Renee was intrigued, and she approached the singing man. But when she stepped up to the booth, a strange sensation momentarily came over her. It lasted only a moment.
What in the world are Bleeny Nugs?
She asked him. In a peculiar accent, the man answered.
They are delicious.
She waited for him to say something else, but he did not. Instead, he handed her a strange item wrapped in paper. She opened it and saw what appeared to be a fuzzy brown shape, almost as if it was out of focus. It didn't look too appetizing, but it smelled incredible. She paused, then took a bite. Renee was surprised to find that she absolutely loved it. She couldn't quite identify what it was, but she agreed with the man. It was just delicious. At home, Renee couldn't stop thinking about the nugs. The piece she had eaten was so unusual and had such a unique flavor. They would be a big hit if more people knew about them, but it seemed the man was only making and selling the treats himself. That night, the woman called her old friend Karen on the telephone. Karen was the senior vice president of merchandising for a major food company. Renee told her all about the amazing snack and convinced her to come try it for herself. The next day, the two arrived at the grocery store and headed straight to the area beside the meat department. The man was there at his little booth, still singing his song. When Karen tried one of the nugs, she was instantly impressed and amazed by the flavor. It was unlike anything she had eaten before.
What's in this?
She asked the man.
What are they made of?
Oh, I cannot give away secret recipe,
he said, and he would speak of it no further. He did, however, explain that he had many other items besides the nugs that were also delicious. He began listing them off. Torvis Chooser, Falney Cup, Malif, Prandel, Bistelkrieg, Feltboy, Woman's Tongue, Prenal Tibbs, Rubelhob, and Alcitrucio Malcalo. Renee and Karen looked at each other, perplexed by the strange names.
Where are you from, exactly?
Asked Renee.
Somewhere else.
He replied with an oddly hypnotic stare.
Far away.
After an awkward pause, Karen told the man who she was and what she did for a living. She said that she might be interested in bringing the nugs, and possibly other recipes, to a larger market.
Oh, I could not do that,
he said.
It would not be possible.
Karen questioned him further, but the man wouldn't give any kind of real answer. Before the women left, Karen convinced the man to give them a few more Bleeny Nugs for the road. As she and Renee exited the store, she put them all into her purse.
Renee, how would you like to see where I work?
Asked Karen with a smile.
Really? I'd like that.
Renee had always been in awe of her childhood friend. Karen was far more successful in life after high school than most of their classmates. The two drove some distance to the large building on the outskirts of the city where Karen worked. On the way, Karen explained that she was going to take the samples to the food testing laboratory. She wanted to know what was in the secret recipe. Renee found it all very interesting, and she was happy to be included. As the women entered the building, Renee was asked to sign a waiver. She was told not to disclose anything she might see inside. They took an elevator to a higher floor, then used a special electronic card to enter a room filled with scientific equipment. Karen approached a short, older man in a white lab coat and explained the situation to him. He then took the wrapped-up snacks, stating, "It will take a while." The next few hours were spent waiting in Karen's office, where the two women ate a delivered dinner together and reminisced about the past. At 7 o'clock, the man in the white lab coat appeared. He seemed concerned and generally confused. He led the two women back to the lab and into a room where there was a large and mysterious machine. He pointed to an opening in the machine where a petri dish was inserted. Several other people wearing lab coats were also gathered around the device.
I don't know how to explain this, said the man, holding a clipboard. First, we tested the sample and thought the equipment wasn't working. It wasn't detecting any substances at all. No sugars, no starches, no food colorings, nothing. We attempted a manual chemical analysis, but we got strange results. We tried everything. It didn't make sense. Either something is wrong with our methods, or this sample is made up of something that doesn't show up in spectrometry. Or
what?
Asked Karen. The man looked at her seriously.
Or the sample didn't really exist.
Karen could only laugh.
That's ridiculous. You must have done something wrong.
But it gets weirder. Look.
He pointed to the petri dish.
What about it? Where's the sample?
Asked Renee.
We don't know,
the man replied, appearing almost frightened.
It just vanished. About 20 minutes ago, it simply disappeared. We watched it disappear, and the backup samples too. They're gone. Completely gone.
Karen and Renee headed back to the grocery store. The scientist came along out of sheer curiosity. Surely there was some kind of rational explanation for all of this. When they arrived, they went down the aisle and straight to the spot where the strange vendor had been.
But instead of the man in his little booth, there was only an ordinary display for a sale that had been going on all month.
Flowers. One day, while Jeff was mowing his lawn, he noticed the most beautiful orange marigold. It seemed to be glowing. Over the sound of the mower, he heard the flower speak to him.
"You're doing a good job,"
it said in a squeaky little voice. A warm feeling came over Jeff, and he smiled and went on with the yard work. Jeff's neighbor, Phil, had the worst yard on the block. It made the whole neighborhood look bad. It was filled with all sorts of old junk. Run-down cars, broken toys, beer cans, and cigarette butts everywhere. Jeff hated the smell of the cigarettes. He also hated the sound of Phil's muscle car as it regularly tore out of the driveway and raced up and down the street, the engine growling and echoing throughout the subdivision. On Friday, Jeff noticed that Phil was having a party. There was a lot of loud music outside, and people were in Phil's backyard with their shirts off. When Jeff crossed his lawn to see what was going on, he passed the flower again, and again it spoke.
"You go tell him what's what, Jeff. You deserve better than to have to deal with all this negativity,"
said the glowing flower.
Yeah, you're right,
replied Jeff.
I'm through being Mr. Nice Guy to that jerk.
He marched right to the fence and started yelling at Phil to turn the music down and to clean up his yard. But Phil only made a nasty gesture and turned the music up even louder than before. Jeff suddenly felt very small and unsure of himself. That week, Phil was a particularly bad neighbor. He drove his car up and down the street like a lunatic. The sound of the engine was like fingers on a chalkboard to Jeff. This went on during all hours of the day, well into the night. As he meticulously trimmed his hedges, Jeff looked down and saw that 2 of the marigolds from before were now glowing. He listened carefully and heard the pair of marigolds speak together in unison.
You gotta do something about that car, Jeff. No one else around here is going to.
Well, what should I do?
He asked the flowers.
You gotta send him a signal. Show him you aren't gonna take it anymore. Don't worry. We'll tell you what to do.
On his way to work in the morning, Phil went to the driveway to get in his car. Someone had slashed all the tires. For the rest of the week, no one heard Phil driving around the subdivision. Jeff looked through the window and saw Phil's dog digging in his garden. He went outside and chased it away. Walking back, he passed the flowers once more. This time, there were 3 glowing marigolds. They sang out together like a choir.
Who does that guy think he is? Letting a mangy mutt like that roam around on other people's property. You gotta stand up for yourself.
I know,
said Jeff.
It's been going on for years. His dog is always barking and running wild. He has no respect for anybody.
Just listen to us, friend. Listen to us and listen good. We'll tell you exactly what to do.
The next morning, Phil went outside in his pajamas to smoke the first cigarette of the day. As he pulled out his lighter, he looked up and immediately froze in horror. There, on the old worn-out trampoline, was the bloody head of his dog. Several weeks went by. Although the police had questioned the neighbors about the dog and the tires, things had pretty much returned to normal. The only problem was that Phil's yard was still such a mess. The more Jeff thought about it, the madder he became. He was so upset that he couldn't even finish shaving. He went out to the yard with half of his face still covered in shaving cream and glared at Phil's property. Now the entire bed of orange flowers was glowing. They spoke together as one.
He'll never change, Jeff. He's such a slob. Just look at that yard. What an eyesore. It's an insult to you and the entire neighborhood.
What should I do? He asked the flowers.
Don't worry about a thing. We'll tell you what to do.
A few days later, the doorbell rang. Jeff calmly answered the door. It was the police. Jeff was immediately arrested and taken into custody for the murder of his neighbor Phil. Jeff told the police exactly what had happened and how he was the true victim. He then found himself spending a lot of time in a little room, talking to a woman with a clipboard. Eventually, Jeff went to live in a hospital on a hill. The woman with the clipboard often came to visit, but would only ask the same questions again and again. Jeff soon began to grow angry with the woman. He did not like her or the hospital. The only good thing about his new life was the view of the garden through his barred window. Out there in the beautiful sunlight were rows and rows of glowing flowers, all singing like a choir. Puppety hands. Recent newlyweds Ralph and Sharon Burnett were on their honeymoon, and their evening was going perfectly. They shared drinks on the beach and enjoyed a romantic candlelit dinner. But then, while strolling through a twisting outdoor marketplace, they somehow became lost. It was dark, Most of the shops were closed up, and there was no one around to ask for directions.
"We'll find the way back to the main road, and then we'll be at the hotel in no time,"
said Ralph. They hurried through the streets, looking for anything that seemed familiar. When the couple turned a corner, they found themselves in an alleyway. There, standing before them, was an extremely tall and imposing man. Startled, the two stopped dead in their tracks.
"Oh, hello,"
said Sharon nervously. The man didn't speak at first. Instead, he began to shiver and convulse as his eyes rolled back into his head. When they rolled forward, they became googly and ping-ponged up and down like a cartoon character's. Then he held up his hands. Upon each hand was a little puppet. One puppet was male, the other female.
"Say hello to the nice people,"
the man said, giggling. The male puppet then came very close to the couple and looked them over. It was dressed in a little suit and a top hat. The puppet turned to its companion and then spoke in a strange and raspy voice.
"They look rather lost to me."
The female puppet, who was wearing a polka dot dress, responded in an exaggerated English accent.
"I agree. Rather unsure of where they are going or how to get there."
The giant man giggled again.
That's Mr. Windsor and Mrs. Cake. They real silly.
He seemed to be mentally challenged, although he had somehow made the puppets speak very clearly. The newlyweds wondered if it was all just an act. Either way, Ralph turned to his wife and said, "I think we made a wrong turn," and the two quickly headed back in the other direction. For the next 20 minutes, Sharon and Ralph had a sneaking suspicion that someone was following them, although they were probably just on edge from the strange encounter in the alleyway. When they arrived at their hotel, most of the lights were out and there was no one at the front desk. They passed a newspaper stand as they walked through the lobby. Ralph remembered glancing at the local paper that morning. The headlines had described a series of mysterious murders in the area. Some tourists had been found stabbed, and others had been strangled. Ralph realized that he had been careless in wandering the dark alleyways with his new wife. Upon entering their room on the 3rd floor, the couple were so exhausted from the day that they went straight to bed. Sharon awoke in the night to a scratching noise coming from the front door. It lasted only a moment and then stopped. She drifted back to sleep. Sometime later, she awoke again, this time to the sound of a door squeaking open and then shutting. At first, she figured that Ralph must have gotten up to use the bathroom or get a drink of water, but then she saw him sleeping next to her in bed. Alarmed, she shook him awake.
"Ralph! Ralph!"
she whispered loudly.
"There are some weird sounds coming from the front door."
The man rubbed his eyes and grumbled. "Don't worry, I locked it. Just go back to sleep." But Sharon could not leave the matter alone.
"Honey, will you please just go check?"
After a few moments, Ralph rose reluctantly from the bed and went to the living room. He flipped on the light switch. There before him was the man with the puppets. Ralph froze where he stood. The giant man instantly exploded toward him, and with one blow, Ralph was knocked unconscious. When he finally came to, both he and his wife were on the floor of the kitchenette, their hands tied and mouths gagged. Sharon had tears in her eyes. Ralph had never felt so helpless. Then, just like they had in the alleyway, the puppets spoke.
"Look at them, my dear,"
exclaimed the male in a raspy voice.
"They seem to be in a bit of a bind." "I agree. There's no way out now."
The giant man spoke and giggled.
Look at Mr. Windsor. He's real silly.
He danced around in joy, making the puppet hands open and close their little mouths.
Look at my puppety hands!
He giggled.
Look at my puppety hands!
As the man paraded madly around the room, Ralph tried desperately to untie the knot that held his hands together. The puppet man turned the other way, and the little puppets disappeared for a moment. When he faced the couple again, the puppet hands each held something that had not been there before. Mr. Windsor had a large knife. Mrs. Cake, a rope with a loop on the end. The man was drooling and panting like an animal. He cried out, his voice higher now.
I'm a gunster wants to get you real good now!
The female puppet shrieked maniacally as it sprung forward, flinging the rope around Sharon's neck. Next to his wife, Ralph felt the knot loosen around his hands. He had untied it just in time to see Mr. Windsor lunge at him with the knife in its felt mouth. It hissed and screeched as it charged. Ralph dodged the little puppet and began wrestling with the man, the blade coming within inches of his throat. Fighting the puppet hand, he looked deep into its beady little eyes and saw that it was somehow alive. In desperation, Ralph lowered his head and bit down hard on the hand, his teeth cutting through the felt material. The puppet man squealed like a hog, and the knife dropped to the floor. Ralph scooped it up. In one powerful swing, he hacked off the giant man's right hand, the male puppet along with it. Then he swung again, completely severing the left. The female puppet fell to the ground with the hand still inside. The man screamed and spit and spun around in circles, blood gushing all over the place. At that moment, the door burst open, and several police officers came charging into the room. Ralph dove to the floor and pulled his poor wife into a corner with him, covering her body with his own, just as several deafening shots were heard. Then it went quiet, and the next sound was that of a large body slumping to the ground. The police quickly untied the woman and helped both victims to their feet. They had been following the puppet man all night, waiting to see if he really was who they suspected him to be. As they escorted the traumatized newlyweds out the door, Ralph turned and looked back to see the bloody scene in the kitchen. A giant man's lifeless body and 2 severed hands. The little puppets were nowhere to be found. Crematorium. Sometimes, after a person died, their family would take the body to the St. Thomas Memorial Crematorium to be cremated. It was less expensive and more practical than a traditional burial, and it was becoming a somewhat popular option in the wooded rural area. Funeral homes from 3 states sent bodies to the facility for disposal. For 30 years, the crematorium was run by a man named William Sternwood Sr., a successful and well-liked businessman and community figure. In his later years, the man's health began to fail. Just before he died, he left the family business to his son, William Jr. Several years after William Jr. took over, a delivery man noticed what seemed to be dead bodies lying on the ground outside the main building. He thought it strange and disturbing, but he never reported it to anyone. Months later, a woman out jogging noticed a horrible smell coming from the property through the trees. She changed her route and never jogged there again. The authorities began to receive more and more complaints about the property, but none of them were ever investigated. Then, one day, while walking his dog through the forest around the property, a man discovered a human skull lying in the dirt. He called the police, who had finally had enough of the reports. When they arrived at the crematorium, they discovered a gruesome scene. Bodies were scattered everywhere. Skeletons and bones were rotting and stacked in broken coffins. Some filled an old broken-down hearse, and others were piled in storage sheds and old barns. A horrifyingly putrid stench filled the air. The pond on the property was drained and found to be filled with bloated corpses. Some even clogged a big pipe at the bottom. Stacks and stacks of bodies that should have been cremated were strewn about in various stages of decay. For months, authorities searched the property and its many outbuildings, trying to identify the remains and make sense of it all. It was discovered that the families of the deceased had been given urns filled with cement dust in place of their loved ones' actual ashes. William Sternwood Jr. was arrested and brought to trial. During the case, the man claimed that the crematory furnace had not worked for many years. He said that he was unable to cremate the bodies. This was later proven to be false. In the end, it was believed that improper ventilation had caused mercury from old tooth fillings in the burning bodies to slowly poison both William Sternwood Sr. and William Sternwood Jr., leading to the illness and eventual death of the father and the madness and strange behavior of the son. Bill worked his entire life down at the factory. It was hot, hard work, and he came home every night exhausted with an aching back. After 43 years at the same horrible job, he was tired. He wanted nothing more than to retire to a warm, tropical paradise and spend his time resting and relaxing. But one day, while working at the factory, Bill simply fell over and died. When he opened his eyes, he was in a strange new place. A giant man reached down and helped him to his feet.
Where am I?
Asked Bill. The man replied,
You're dead. This is the afterlife.
Incredible. Just incredible, said Bill, looking around the place. He stretched his arms and yawned.
Finally, time to rest.
Bill turned to the giant man, who seemed to be some kind of angel.
Now that I'm here, what's the first thing I should do?
He asked. The angel was walking away, apparently in a hurry to get somewhere, but turned back momentarily to speak.
Well, I recommend getting a job. It's rough out there.
Desert Island. The jungle was a terrible place to be lost. Robert Fishman knew. He had been wandering through the hot and humid maze of giant plants and trees for years, ever since his plane crashed that tragic day, ever since he lost everyone he ever loved or cared about. He was trapped, and there didn't seem to be any other humans around. Maybe he had been traveling in circles. Maybe the jungle went on forever. Somehow, he managed to survive, to find food and water, but he wondered if any life was worth living now that his wife and children were gone. Sometimes, strange things happened, and Robert began to wonder if he was going crazy. One of those things was the arm that appeared. Just an arm, floating in the jungle. It materialized for a few moments, waved to him, and then it was gone. Sometime later, he heard a voice. It seemed to call to him, to call his name. Then it faded away. Soon there were more images and sounds. The face of a man with a beard and little round glasses appeared to him before vanishing completely. A woman's voice asked if he wanted to watch TV. Then he thought he heard the theme song from an old show he liked. It was getting worse and worse. I'm going insane, Robert said to himself. It must be the loneliness. Exhausted, dirty, and drenched in sweat, Robert pushed on. He moved farther and farther each day through the jungle, trying to find some kind of town or even a simple dirt road. But there was no end in sight.
He seems to like the plants,
said a voice. One day, Robert came to a place where the trees thinned out a bit. It was there that he heard the sound of the ocean. He saw a beach up ahead, and he ran to it. Above him, suspended in mid-air at the edge of the vast sea, was a mirror. When Robert looked into the mirror, he saw his own reflection looking back at him. But behind him was the man with the beard and little round glasses, as well as many other people. They all wore white doctor's coats. Robert saw that the trees of the jungle were only decorative potted plants.
Robert is one of our more interesting patients here,
said the doctor.
He has been this way ever since his family was killed. They were on vacation when their plane crashed into the jungles of South America. He was the only survivor.
At that moment, the mirror vanished, leaving Robert completely alone just like before. There were no more voices, only the sound of the waves rolling gently on the beach. Geology. Terence Gardner was a professor of geology at a prestigious university in Massachusetts. He and his associate, Darren Brush, had the honor of being among the very first to explore a newly discovered cave system located in the Eurasian country of Georgia, home to some of the deepest caverns in the world. Much of the system had been underwater for thousands of years, but a local mining company had pumped all the water out, and so, for the first time in human history, the sumps were clear and the passage accessible. Once the two men crossed through the Virgin Cave's entrance, they found it to be quite ordinary. However, as they penetrated further, the formations grew more interesting. Deeper and deeper they went into the unexplored hollow of the earth. After several days of traversing the route, the pair came upon a majestic sight. It was a massive and wondrous cavern of speleothem. There were grand stalagmite columns atop shiny ornate flowstone, and overhead, regal flowing drapery and long translucent soda straws stabbed straight out of the rocky ceiling.
I have a feeling something even more interesting lies farther inside,
Terry's associate Darren said rather unexpectedly.
What are you going on about?
The professor asked in surprise.
These formations are what we came across the world to study.
He had already begun setting up a type of camp or scientific staging area near a wall of calcite boxwork and cave popcorn. Darren pointed ahead, his bright headlamp illuminating the way. Before him was a downward path, flanked on either side by milky pools of alkaline water.
There's something down there,
he said, his soft voice reverberating throughout the silent, dripping caverns. He then began moving down and away from the professor, into the darkness. Professor Gardner had maintained an uneasy feeling about this trip since it was first conceived. There was something odd about his companion's behavior. From the moment they had committed to coming, Darren had been acting strangely. There was an increasingly disheveled and deranged look about him, and his right hand had begun to develop a peculiar tremor. The professor had first noticed it on the plane ride from Boston. Reluctantly, Professor Gardner followed the man down the path and toward what seemed to be the beginning of a completely new channel. Darren, just ahead, shined his light on something directly above him. There were symbols, perhaps writing, hewn into the rock above the entrance to the new tunnel.
You see, Professor, this is what we came across the world to study. Not natural cave formations, but something more
preternatural. Terry was confused, not only because of the symbols, but because of Darren's words. It was as if he had known the symbols would be there the entire time, as if he was expecting to see them. Terry recalled that it was Darren who had been so adamant they be the first to explore the cave when the men were back in Massachusetts. Mr. Brush turned to face the professor, enthralled by the discovery. An ancient race of beings, perhaps alien to this world. They created the message you see above you, during a time lost to the memory of man. Terry Gardner was highly skeptical. He was a man of rigid science and logic, and he was not susceptible to ridiculous flights of fancy. But before the professor could even snap a photograph of the puzzling symbols, Darren was hurrying down the new tunnel without him. Furious at his associate for going off without a word in such a place, Terry could do nothing but follow behind. He was going to catch up with Mr. Brush and demand some straight answers. As he followed the light ahead in the darkness, Terry noticed a shift in the formations around him. There was a transition from mostly blank limestone to shimmering clusters of selenite that exploded out into magnificent spiny shapes.
Darren! Darren, look at this!
But the man ahead would not respond. The fact that his associate was still not slowing down, despite the discovery of such a pristine garden of spiky formations, only frustrated and confused the professor more. The radiating masses and furry aggregates around them grew larger and larger. But still, Darren would not slow down to have a look. The light ahead disappeared around a corner. Terry followed. But when he finally caught up to Mr. Brush, he discovered that they were now in a new chamber, a grand and majestic one. The professor gaped, unable to explain it. It was all black and seemed to be made of obsidian, but the lines of the walls and ceiling did not appear to be natural. They were perfectly constructed, as if by the hands of man. There were strange pillars and symbols on all sides. Just ahead was a glistening black staircase that led up to a gigantic vertically rectangular frame built into the wall. It towered 30 or 40 feet above them and displayed some unearthly geometry. Terry glanced at Darren and saw he was looking at the frame. The professor followed Darren's gaze to the large rectangular shape. Then his eyes widened. The frame, he realized, resembled an enormous door.
What is this?
Darren did not turn around, but he did speak, his voice ominous and strange.
This is the temple,
he said.
The first temple built by the Shoggoths who prepared the way.
The professor furrowed his brow. He couldn't believe it. It was not possible for anything to be built in this place. The caverns had been unreachable since before the dawn of man. Only modern pumping technology had made the journey possible. Although evidence to the contrary was all around him, he was in utter denial of its reality.
What are you saying, Darren? What on earth has gotten into you? This is not a temple. It's simply a strange obsidian formation. A coincidence.
But when Darren turned around, Terry saw that the man's face was twisted into a deranged grin. His eyes were wide, and he began laughing maniacally.
No, Professor!
Terry took a few steps back.
This is the gate! It is the doorway to another world.
Darren turned again and held his arms up to the vertically rectangular frame at the top of the short staircase. Terry looked up the steps at the frame, then back at Darren.
Have you gone completely mad?
He continued until he was standing just before the colossal door.
I've waited my entire life for this moment. I never imagined that it would truly come.
and then I would be the one to summon her, to bring her back, so that she can purify this world and rule again.
The professor could hardly process what was happening. It seemed that Darren had gone completely insane.
This is the end of your world, Professor! The beast is coming!
Darren's eyes began to roll back in his head, and he started chanting strange words that Terry thought must surely be gibberish. But as Darren spoke, the professor felt the very earth beneath his feet begin to shift and quake. Darren raised his arms high above his head, facing the symbol before him, and began to speak some unholy invocation.
Come forth now, black goat of the woods! Ea Shab Niggurath! Ea Shab Niggurath! The black goat of the woods with 1,000 young!
A sudden low-pitched hum, as if from a large electrical transformer, added itself to the cacophony. The professor watched as Darren's form was enveloped by a strange red light illuminating from the trembling obsidian. His body spasmed violently from side to side, and the bulb in his headlamp exploded in a shower of sparks. Then, finally, he collapsed, apparently dead on the floor. A terrifying cracking rumble thundered from the top of the steps, and Terence Gardner watched in horror as the doorway began to break open. From somewhere beyond the widening rift came a deafening, inhuman bellow, unlike anything that could be described. The hectic wavering of the earth around him caused the professor to fall on the floor and cover his head with his hands. After a few moments, the rumbling subsided, and all became quiet once more. When the man looked up, he saw that the solid wall at the top of the steps above him was now an enormous gaping hole. It seemed the gate was open. With his partner lying motionless on the floor, Terry was all alone now in the chamber. Professor Terence Gardner, who was once a respected pillar of Miskatonic University, had become nothing more than a lost and terrified child. And now, before him, was a gigantic black opening, leading to some undefined Stygian abyss. But the professor could not help himself. He was overwhelmed by curiosity. He stood up, paused for a moment, then climbed the obsidian staircase to the massive opening. When he reached the top, he moved closer, shining his headlamp into the void. What he saw staring back from the murky expanse shattered his mind. There, before him, was a single, towering, incomprehensible mass, made up of 1,000 goat-like eyes and 1,000 snapping mouths. A hideous tentacled aberration emerging from some other world into this one. The man had suddenly found himself face to face with the unholy bringer of the apocalypse. Then, at that final moment in which Terry comprehended all the hidden truths that had been obscured by the cynicism of men like himself, he saw the entire perverse thing explode out from the darkness toward him. Thanks for listening. For more information on the book, please visit scarystoriestribute.com. And for more of my work, visit ajdanna.com. Sweet dreams.